Marchmont Hall lay black and silent past midnight, and the only sound in it was the ragged breath of a man dragging himself across the floor of his own ballroom.
Have you ever seen anything so
The
drab?
great room had been built for dancing. 40 years before,
She looks
Gideon's
positively
father had
homemade.
laid its floor with
There
oak
it
brought
is,
down from the
the
home
hidden
wood,
codicil.
and had opened it
So
every
he
Michaelmas to
truly
half the
betrayed
county.
us.
And Gideon himself, as a boy, had slid the
Old
length
man
of it
Fenwick's
in his
lost everything, I
stockinged
hear.
feet while the fiddlers
Worse
tuned.
than that, they say he's
Tonight there
finally
was
dead.
no music in it at all. Only the scrape of a man's own body across boards that had once held him up without asking anything of him in return. The tall windows stood uncurtained, admitting a thin, colorless moonlight
Look at this.
that fell across the
It weren't
floor
no
in long
accident, Sir
bars.
Gideon.
And somewhere
Someone
beyond
meant
them,
for him to
the
die.
home wood stood black
The
and
total
still
cannot be
against a
this
sky
high.
gone hard with the first frost of the year.
£6,412.
Sir Gideon Marchmont
It is
had crossed
all
200
gone.
yards of open ground at Waterloo, with grape shot falling round him like rain. And in all that noise and slaughter, he had not once made a sound like the one that came out of
The
him,
court
now
finds the
half
conveyance
curse,
to be fraudulent.
half sob,
The
bitten
previous
off
will is
before it could
hereby
finish.
reinstated,
His
with
legs
costs
would not
against
answer
the
him.
defendant.
They had not answered him in 2 years, not since a night on Hollow Lane, when his horse had screamed and reared beneath him, and the world had gone white, then black, then, for the rest of his life, still. His cane had rolled 3 feet beyond his reach, innocent as a dropped glove, and he clawed after it across the oak boards, his shirt soaked through, his shoulders shaking with an effort that would have been nothing at all, once, to a man who had swung a saber from horseback and thought little of it. "Come here," he told the cane, as though it might listen, as though anything in this house still obeyed him. He reached again. His fingers grazed the wood and sent it spinning another inch away, and he laughed a short, ugly sound with no mirth left in it, and that was when he heard her. Not a gasp, not the rustle of skirts snatched back in alarm, only a single pair of steady boots, stopping in the doorway behind him. Gideon went very still. A man does not turn to look at whoever has found him like this, sweating, cursing, chasing his own cane across the floor of the house his father built. "Get out," he said, to the boards, to the dark. The boots did not move. "I said get out." "I heard you the first time," said a voice he had heard only twice before, once at the latch gate of the church, and once the day before at the altar rail. His wife. The word still sat wrong in his mouth, 3 days old and unfamiliar as a coat cut for another man. "Then what would you call standing there?" He pushed himself half upright against the leg of a chair and glared up at her from the floor with all the dignity a man could summon from that position, which was none at all. "I'd call it waiting," said Verity Marchmont, "to see whether you want the cane or you want my hand. I'll give you either. I won't give you both, and I certainly won't give you pity. So you had best decide, Sir Gideon, before that floor takes what's left of the fight out of you." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Gideon Marchmont did a thing he had not done in front of a living soul in 2 years. He rolled onto his side, looked up at her fully, and let her see all of it, the sweat, the fury, the shame, none of it hidden. "The cane," he said. She crossed the room without hurry, picked it up and held it out at arm's length. She did not kneel. She did not offer her shoulder. She stood and watched him haul himself up the leg of the chair, hand over hand, until he had dragged himself into the seat with his chest heaving, like a man who had run a mile. "There," she said. "That wasn't so very hard, was it? You've a cruel streak in you, madam. I've a truthful one. There's a difference, and you'll learn it if you live with me long enough." He studied her for a long moment in the candlelight, this stranger who had crossed his ruined ballroom without flinching, who had neither fled at the sight of him nor rushed to smother him in the kind of pity he had come, these 2 years, to dread rather more than contempt. "You did not scream," he said, half to himself, "nor faint, nor call for a servant to spare yourself the sight of it. Should I have? Most women of my acquaintance would have." "I am not most women of your acquaintance," Verity said. "I am a lace manufacturer's daughter who has watched grown men weep over a ledger, and I find very little in this world frightens me half so much as being lied to about the true state of things. You, at least, have the decency to be honestly wretched about your own circumstances, rather than pretending otherwise for my comfort." He did not know a single true thing about her. That, more than the indignity of the floor, was what needled him worst. He knew she was 23. He knew her father had kept a lace manufactory in Nottingham, one of those brick-and-frame concerns that had clattered along well enough until the frame breakers came through the streets some years back, and the war had ended and taken half the trade's custom with it, and this past summer Josiah Fenwick had gone into the ground beneath a weight of debt he had not lived to see settled. He knew that his own cousin had come into this very room 6 weeks past with a proposal dressed up as mercy. You want the county to stop whispering that the Marchmont line dies with a cripple in a wheeled chair, Edgar had said, pouring himself a glass of Gideon's own brandy without being asked for it. Take a wife, a grateful girl, one who needs you too badly ever to look at you the way the rest of them do. I don't need saving, Edgar. Of course you don't. That smile of his, the one that never once reached his eyes. You need an heir, Gideon, and a wife who won't scream when the last candle's put out. He had settled himself into the good chair by the fire, quite as though the house were his own to sit in. Think of it as a kindness done all round. There's a girl in Nottingham whose father's just died, owing more than the estate will ever see back a lace man, respectable enough, ruined by the frame breakers and the peace both. She'll be glad of a roof, and you'll be spared the trouble of courting, which I don't imagine appeals to you in your present state. Everyone is satisfied. Everyone is grateful. Where is the harm in it? The harm, Gideon had wanted to say, is that you have already decided this without asking me, the way you have decided a great many things these 2 years past, and I have let you. Because it was easier than fighting a war, I did not know I was already losing. But he had said none of it. He had only refused, that first time, and the second, and had believed wrongly that a third refusal would be the end of the matter. He had refused it 3 times, and then Edgar had returned with a leather folder of settlement papers already drawn, assuring him the terms were entirely standard, generous even, and that Miss Fenwick's own solicitor, a country attorney of no particular note, had reviewed and approved them on her behalf. Gideon had read perhaps half of it before his eyes had tired, and his patience with the whole business had run out, and had signed where Edgar showed him, trusting, as he had trusted a great many things these 2 years, that his cousin had managed the particulars honestly. He had trusted Edgar with a great many things, in those first months after the accident, when the fever had left him too weak to hold a pen steady, and too proud to admit how weak he truly was. Edgar had sat with him then, patient and attentive, reading him letters, and managing his correspondence, and Gideon had thought, at the time, that he was fortunate indeed to have family willing to shoulder such a burden without complaint. It had not occurred to him, in those exhausted early weeks, to wonder why his cousin seemed so very willing, nor to ask what manner of accounting Edgar kept of favors rendered against favors he intended, eventually, to collect. Now she stood in his ruined ballroom at midnight, cool as well water, and Gideon understood, watching her, that whatever picture his cousin had painted of a grateful, frightened bride content to take her allowance and trouble him no further, the woman standing in front of him bore no resemblance to it at all. Your solicitor, he said, the one who reviewed the settlement on your behalf. Who was he? Something moved behind Verity's eyes, there and gone before he could name it. I have no solicitor, Sir Gideon. I have never had occasion to need one, and I signed whatever was placed in front of me, because your cousin assured my mother it was the ordinary business of such arrangements, and we were in no position to question a Marchmont's word on the matter. Then you never read the settlement yourself. Not properly. I read a great deal of it, Verity said slowly, though I confess I did not understand every clause, and there were pages I was asked to sign before I had finished with the ones before them, Mr. Edgar Marchmont standing at my elbow the whole while, remarking how very tedious he found the law himself, and wasn't it a mercy neither of us need trouble our heads over it further. She said none of this lightly. Instead, she looked at her husband, upright now in his chair and breathing hard, and said only, I begin to think, Sir Gideon, that your cousin took a great deal more care over the wording of that settlement than either of us was ever meant to notice. His jaw worked. You still have your copy of it? Locked in my writing case. I had not thought until this moment that it wanted reading twice. Then read it again, Gideon said, properly this time, and tonight if you are able. I begin to suspect we have both been considerably less careful with our own signatures than either of us can afford to have been. The tall clock in the passage ticked on into the silence that followed, and somewhere above them, unheard by either, a housekeeper who had been standing rather too long outside a rather thin door drew back from it at last and went up to bed with a great deal to think about. Morning found Sir Gideon already at his desk in the study, buried behind a wall of ledgers with a pair of spectacles pushed low on his nose, and when Verity found him there, he looked up with none of the raw honesty of the night before still showing in his face. That had been folded away again, put back wherever he kept such things. "You're up early," he said. "Most fine ladies of my acquaintance sleep till noon. I'm not a fine lady. My hands could prove it if you cared to look." "I would not." He returned to his figures. "You'll find the household runs itself well enough. Mrs. Yardley will show you what's what. You needn't trouble yourself with the estate or with me. Take your rooms, take your allowance, and we shall get on very well." "Get on," Verity repeated. "You mean live under one roof and never speak." "I mean precisely that." There was a knock, and a broad, gray-haired woman of some 50 years came in with a tray, set it down without spilling a drop, and took her time about arranging the cups, in the manner of a servant who has decided a room needs listening to a little longer than its business strictly requires. "Coffee, sir. And for you, my lady, whatever you'd prefer, there's tea, if you'd rather." "Coffee will do very well, Mrs. Yardley. Thank you." The housekeeper's eyes went once from Gideon's shuttered face to Verity's still one, and something in her own expression did not quite match the mildness of her voice. "You'll forgive me saying, my lady, this house hasn't seen two people at breakfast in that study together since Sir Gideon's father was alive. It's no trouble at all having 2 cups instead of 1. None at all." She withdrew before either of them could answer her, and the door closed with rather more care than a door needs. Gideon did not look up from his ledger. "She talks a great deal for a woman who says so little." I noticed. The pen stopped moving over the page. She had not meant unkindness by it, but she had learned in one night that soft words slid off Gideon Marchmont like rain off oilcloth, and that only a hard truth ever made him lift his head. "Because that is what I was brought here for, is it not?" she said. "A wife to give the Marchmont name and heir, and never mind the man attached to the name, and never mind, either, what was quietly written into the settlement that made the arrangement binding. So I should like to know, Sir Gideon, exactly what it is I signed my own name to 3 days ago, since neither of us appears to have read it with any great care." He set the pen down very carefully. "You found something in it. I found a good deal in it. Once I sat down last night and read every page in order, rather than the pages your cousin thought worth pointing to. I should like your opinion of it, if you can spare the morning, for I confess 2 pairs of careful eyes seem a wiser precaution than one, given how badly 1 pair alone served each of us 3 days ago." She drew the folded settlement from beneath her shawl and set it on the desk between them, her hands steadier than she felt as she did it, and it was in the reading of it, together slowly, the fire burning low, both their heads bent over the same close-printed clauses, that the true shape of the thing they had married into first began to show itself to both of them at once. It had begun, Verity thought afterward, on an afternoon in high summer, when a gentleman in a very good coat had knocked at her mother's door in Nottingham, with a smile that never once faltered. She could still see the town as it had been that season, the shop fronts along the Lace Market, shuddered early against trouble that had come often enough in years past, though it did not come that week. The frames in her father's own workroom, standing idle since a night some winters back when men with blackened faces had gone up and down the street, breaking whatever iron they could reach, and her father, God rest him, had stood in his own doorway with a lantern and begged them to spare his, and they had, though it made no difference in the end, for the trade itself had gone soft, and never quite recovered, the long war ending and taking half the demand for good lace and hosiery with it. Josiah Fenwick had held on years past the point when a wiser man would have sold up, because the frames had been his own father's before him, and he could not make himself believe that honest work could fail so completely. He had gone into his grave that summer, believing himself a failure, with the bank's men already circling what little remained, and it was into that grief that Edgar Marchmont had walked, smiling, offering mercy. My cousin Gideon is a great man laid low, he had told Verity's mother, turning a signet ring once around his finger as he spoke. A hero of Waterloo, no less you will have read of the charge his regiment made, though he would never tell you himself, far too modest a man for that. A dreadful accident took his legs from him 2 years since, and he has borne it, I confess, without complaint, though it has cost him dear in every other way that matters. He needs a steady wife more than he needs another creditor at his door. And you, Mrs. Fenwick, forgive my bluntness. You need your daughter settled somewhere. Her father's debts cannot follow her. Verity had asked then the only question that had seemed to matter. Does he know of this arrangement? Has he asked for a wife himself? He has asked for nothing, Edgar had said, with what she had taken at the time for sorrow. That is rather the trouble, Miss Fenwick. 2 years in a chair have convinced my cousin that no woman living could want him. I mean to prove him wrong, if you will let me try. She had written her one letter that week, not to Gideon Marchmont, but to the Nottingham Bank, promising to do what was required of her if it kept her mother's roof intact. She had never once set pen to paper for the baronet himself, nor received one from him, and she understood now, sitting across from him in his cold study, 3 days into a marriage neither of them had truly chosen, that whatever else Edgar Marchmont had managed between them, he had managed the paperwork of it a great deal more carefully than either of them had troubled to notice at the time. The wedding itself, she remembered as a cruelty, dressed carefully in lace, her own lace, the last good piece her father's workshop had ever produced, which she had worn because she had nothing finer and would not borrow what she could not repay. She had walked up the steps of the parish church with her chin level and her hands steady, past the summer silks of the county's better families, past gentlemen who tipped their hats to her with smirks tucked carefully under the brim, and she had heard the whispers ripple down the nave ahead of her like wind through standing corn. That's her, the pretty little thing from the lace trade. Same as any of them, I dare say. A girl will marry a wreck of a man for that much land. Her mother had walked beside her as far as the church door, in her one good black gone rusty at the seams, gripping Verity's arm rather harder than the pace required. Mrs. Fenwick had said almost nothing. Throughout the whole arrangement grief had taken most of her words along with her husband, but at the threshold she had stopped and said, low enough that only Verity could hear it, "You need not do this for my sake, my dear. I would rather starve honestly than—" and Verity had cut her off gently, because they both knew it was not true, and because there was no undoing a thing already 3 weeks signed and sealed. "I have already decided, mother," she had said. "Let me decide it well, at least." And she had gone in alone, since it was not the custom in that parish for a mother to give away a daughter, and there was no father left to do it. At the front of the church, in a wheeled chair polished to a shine that did nothing to disguise what it was, Sir Gideon Marchmont had sat staring straight ahead like a man facing a firing squad, and he had not once turned to look at her through the whole of the ceremony. When the rector reached the words to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, someone at the back of the church had laughed one short, ugly bark of it, muffled fast behind a glove, and Gideon had heard it, and Verity had watched his jaw go to stone. When the service closed, Gideon had turned chair 3 feet toward her and said, low enough for her alone to hear, "I'll spare you the rest of it, madam. No sense pretending, in front of people who came only to watch us fail." Then he had wheeled himself away down the aisle alone, while the whole parish watched, and not one soul among them had moved to open the door for him. Verity had crossed that church in 6 strides and opened it herself. "I don't require." He had begun. "I know you don't," she'd said, holding it wide. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I'll be damned before I let these people watch you struggle and feel the better for it." He had stopped in the doorway and looked up at her properly, for the first time. "You've a mouth on you, Lady Marchmont. You'll grow used to it." That had been the whole of it, the first thing between them that had felt, for half a heartbeat, like something a marriage might one day be built upon. And then he had gone cold again by supper, and she had understood before the week was out that he meant to drive her off, before she could choose to stay, so that he might tell himself he had known all along that she would go. Now, in the gray light of his study, with the settlement papers spread between them, Verity watched her husband turn that same coldness over in his hands like a tool he was no longer certain he wished to use. Read me the clause again, Gideon said. The one you marked. She found the page and read it aloud a second time, a short paragraph, buried some dozen pages in, providing that in the event Sir Gideon Marchmont should at any time be found incapable, by reason of infirmity of body or mind, of managing his own affairs, the whole of the marriage settlement, including the administration of Lady Marchmont's own pin money, and any future issue's inheritance, should pass into the keeping of a named trustee for the duration of that incapacity. And the trustee named, in small unremarkable print at the clause's foot, was Mr. Edgar Marchmont. He did not merely arrange our marriage, Verity said slowly, once she had finished reading. He wrote himself into the very bones of it. Whatever happens to either of us, Sir Gideon, your cousin appears to have secured himself a claim not only on your estate, but on mine as well, should the right misfortune ever befall you. Outside the study window, the last of the season's swallows were gathering along the stable roof, readying to go south before the cold came down, and neither of them was watching them, because both, for the first time since the wedding, were looking at the same question at once and finding that they did not like the shape of it at all. To what end, Gideon said, would a man go to such lengths over a clause most brides would never think to read at all? I don't yet know, but I mean to find out, and I should think you would rather know it too, than sit behind that door pretending the matter settled. Beyond the window, the home farm's stubble fields ran pale and thin toward the church tower, the last of a harvest that had been thin everywhere that year, the sky having sat gray and sunless over half the kingdom the summer before, and left corn dear in tempers, short from Lincolnshire to the Nottingham frame shops alike. Gideon had signed away more in tenant relief this 12-month than his father would have thought prudent, and had told himself it was ordinary charity, the kind any landlord owed his people in a hard season, and had not once stopped to ask who had carried those figures to him, or whether the sums he signed were the sums that reached the men who needed them. There is more in this house I have not troubled to question than I care to admit, he said at last, half to himself. You will forgive me if I am slow to trust the asking of it. I don't require your trust, Verity said, only your attention. The rest can follow, if it comes at all. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her the way a man looks at a debt he has only just realized he owes. You are a very unusual woman, Lady Marchmont, he said finally. I do not believe I have met your like before, in London or in the county both. I am a lace manufacturer's daughter who learned arithmetic before she learned French, Verity said, and who has watched enough good men ruined by other men's carelessness to have very little patience left for pretending things are other than they are. I do not know that unusual is quite the word for it. I should call it merely practical. Call it what you like, Gideon said. I find myself considerably more glad of it than I was prepared to admit 3 days ago. Then, for the first time since she had crossed his threshold 3 days before, Gideon Marchmont set his spectacles down upon the desk, and did not tell her to leave. They spent the better part of that morning, with the settlement spread across the desk between them, Gideon reading each clause aloud in turn, while Verity followed along on her own copy, both of them working with the particular slow care of people who have already been burned once by trusting a document they did not read closely enough. Here, Gideon said some while later, tapping a paragraph 2/3 down the 9th page. The trustee clause is not alone. Look at this, a provision naming Edgar joint executor of any settlement made upon our children, should we have them, with full discretion over the timing and manner of their inheritance until they come of age. And here, further on, a clause permitting the trustee to act without reference to the other party, in cases where I quote swift action may be judged necessary to protect the estate's interests. Which means, Verity said slowly, that your cousin gave himself the power to act alone, without consulting either of us, provided only that he judged it necessary. A man may judge a great many things necessary if no one is left to argue the judgment. He drafted this himself, Gideon said. I would stake a good deal on it. The language is too careful, too precisely aimed, to have come from any country attorney doing ordinary business. He set the page down and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, a gesture Verity was beginning to recognize as the one he made when a suspicion long held at arm's length finally closed the distance. I signed this, without reading past the 4th page, Lady Marchmont, because Edgar assured me it was standard, and because I had grown accustomed, these 2 years, to trusting his word over my own patience for close reading. And I signed it, Verity said, because I had no one to tell me it was anything but standard, and because a bride is not generally encouraged to interrogate the man who has just settled her mother's debts. My own attorney, had I possessed one, might have caught it in an afternoon. As it was, I had only my cousin-in-law's assurance that the whole business was a formality, and a mother too grateful for the settling of her debts to think of questioning the terms that settled them. There was a soft knock at that moment, and Mrs. Yardley came in with the coffee tray, set it down, and lingered rather longer than the business of arranging cups strictly required. Her eyes, moving once over the papers, spread across the desk before she seemed to catch herself and withdraw them. "Mrs. Yardley," Verity said, before the housekeeper could reach the door, "may I ask you something and trust you to answer plainly?" "You may ask, my lady. Whether I can answer plainly depends rather on what's asked." "Do you know whether Mr. Edgar Marchmont has ever taken a particular interest in this household's legal papers? Settlements, wills, that manner of document?" Something in the housekeeper's broad, weathered face went still. She glanced once at Gideon, as though seeking permission for a thing she had perhaps wanted to say for some while, and found it in his silence. "I'll say this much, my lady, and no more today, because I'd not have you think me a gossip nor a liar, and I've been called neither in 30 years of service." She folded her hands before her. "Mr. Edgar has had the running of a great many papers in this house these 2 years past, and I've watched him do it with my own eyes, and thought nothing ill of it at the time, because grief makes a man trust whoever seems willing to carry the weight for him. I knew Sir Gideon's father a long while, my lady, before either of you were born to trouble each other. There's a good man still in this house, under 2 years of being told he's finished, but he'll drive you off before he lets himself lean on you, if you let him, on account of it being the only power he's got left, to hold the power to be the one who lets go first. Mind you don't let him?" "I don't intend to," Verity said. "No," Mrs. Yardley said, studying her with an expression that had shed most of its careful blankness. "I don't believe you do." And she withdrew before either of them could press her further, leaving the coffee steaming untouched on the tray. "You'll need to understand how this land is held," Gideon said, once the door had closed, "before you can understand why a clause like that one might matter to my cousin more than it would to an ordinary man, standing to inherit nothing at all." He drew out an old document, its ribbon gone the color of weak tea, and spread it across the desk. "My grandfather settled this estate in tail mail, 3 generations back, meaning it cannot be sold, nor left away, nor divided, but must pass whole to the nearest male heir of the body, generation on generation. My father inherited it from his father. I inherit it from mine. And if I die without a son, it passes to Edgar." "It passes to Edgar," Gideon confirmed. "His father was my father's younger brother, and inherited nothing under the settlement but an annuity of some £300 a year, which is the whole of why Edgar grew up in this house, eating my father's bread and calling it charity, and never once, so far as I ever saw, forgave the arrangement that made it so. My father took him in kindly enough when his own father died young, and raised the 2 of us near enough as brothers, and I loved him for it, once. The way a boy loves an older cousin who can outrun him and outshoot him, and make the whole business of growing up look easy. He is 8 years my senior. He has watched me inherit everything he believes should by rights have been divided more fairly, and he has done it, until lately, with very great patience." He was quiet a moment, watching her with an expression she had not yet learned to read. "I find myself wondering," he said slowly, "what manner of man spends 6 weeks drafting a marriage settlement with such care, for a bride he has never met, over terms he must have known she would never think to question. That is not the work of a man seizing an opportunity as it arose. That is the work of a man who had already decided, long before he ever came to your mother's parlor, precisely what shape his opportunity would need to take." "Then he did not merely find me convenient," Verity said slowly. "He built the whole arrangement around what I could be made to represent, before he ever knew what I was actually like." "I begin to think so," Gideon said. "Which means, Lady Marchmont, that we are both of us considerably more central to his design than either of us understood 3 days ago, When we thought ourselves merely inconvenient obstacles, he had chosen to marry off to one another out of spite. But the land cannot pass to him while you live, Verity said, whatever he wishes, and whatever clauses he has written into a marriage settlement. No, the land itself cannot. Gideon's mouth had gone thin and hard. But a settlement clause naming him trustee of my wife's portion, in the event of my incapacity, wants is no death at all to take effect. It wants only a finding from a court, from a commission, from any body with the authority to declare a man unfit to manage his own affairs. There is a thing the law calls an inquisition of lunacy, Lady Marchmont, and I begin to think that clause was never drafted for an ordinary bride's protection at all. It was drafted to give my cousin a second door into this family's fortune, quite separate from the estate itself, in case the first door waiting on my death, or on a formal finding against me, should ever prove slower to open than he wished. There was a small sound at the study door just then, the particular soft scrape of a boot drawn back too slowly, and when Gideon called out, sharply, "Who's there?" a young footman named Sedgwick put his head round the frame with a bow, so prompt it looked rehearsed, and said only that he had come to ask whether the fire wanted building up, and had not liked to interrupt. Gideon told him the fire would do very well as it was, and the door closed again, and neither Gideon nor Verity remarked upon it further just then, though Verity found she remembered the man's face rather more clearly than she had troubled to remember any other servants in the house. "Should the court ever find against you," Verity said, once the door had settled, "who is likely to be appointed committee of your estate?" "The nearest male relation of good character and established involvement in the management of the property," Gideon said, "which, for the last 2 years, has been Edgar in every particular but the title. He signs what I sign. He hires whom I hire, and now, it appears, he has arranged matters, so that even my own wife's portion falls under his hand the moment such a finding is made, rather than waiting on a separate proceeding to secure it. Then the marriage itself was never merely a means of making you look mismanaged and unfit before a court," Verity said slowly, working the logic through as she spoke it. "It was a second instrument entirely a way of reaching my portion, and any child's inheritance, besides, through a door quite separate from the estate's own entail. 2 claims built into one arrangement, Sir Gideon, and both of them resting on the same single finding." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face had gone past anger now into something quieter and more resolved. "I believe you are right, and I believe I owe you an apology for not reading 4 pages of my own signature more carefully before I asked you to trust me with the rest of your life. We are neither of us short of things to apologize for in this business," Verity said. "I should rather spend the time proving what he has done than dividing up the blame for having missed it. We are allies in this, whether either of us finds the arrangement comfortable or not. We have the same enemy, and between the 2 of us, very little left to lose by fighting him properly instead of waiting to be finished by degrees." "Allies," Gideon repeated, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "You have read one clause of one document and already built the shape of his whole design from it. I have spent 3 years watching men build cases against my father out of documents. He trusted them to explain, honestly," Verity said. "I have grown rather quick at recognizing the shape of it, Sir Gideon, however carefully it's dressed." His jaw worked. For a moment she thought he would retreat behind his ledgers again, the way Mrs. Yardley had warned her he might, and she watched him gather himself to do it, and then, visibly, set the impulse aside. "There is a thing I have never said aloud to anyone," he said instead, "though I suspect Mrs. Yardley has guessed at it these 2 years past. Edgar was not always the man you have met these 3 days. When we were boys, he taught me to ride a green horse before I had the courage to try it myself. He took a beating from my father's steward once, rather than tell whose idea it had been to swim the mill pond in December. I loved him, Verity, the plain, uncomplicated way a younger boy loves an older cousin who makes the whole business of growing up look easy. I do not know precisely when the loving stopped being returned, or whether it ever was returned at all, or whether I have simply spent 20 years mistaking his patience for affection, when it was, the whole time, merely the patience of a man counting the years until his chance arrived. That is not a foolish thing to have believed," Verity said. A person may be genuinely kind at 19 and genuinely cruel at 30, and neither version cancels the other out. I do not think you are obliged to call your whole childhood a lie merely because the ending turned out badly. No, Gideon agreed slowly. I do not suppose I am. It is easier, all the same, to be angry at a stranger than at a man who once taught you to ride. Was there ever a moment, Verity asked quietly, when you might have seen it coming? Had you thought to look? Gideon considered this with evident care. Perhaps. My father used to say in his last years that Edgar had a way of remembering every slight and forgetting every kindness, and that a man built that way eventually runs out of room to store the difference honestly. I thought it an old man's harshness at the time. I begin to think it was simply an old man's accuracy, which I mistook for harshness because I did not wish to believe it of someone I loved. Grief does that, Verity said. It makes us slow to believe ill of the people we have already decided to love, long after the evidence has begun to argue otherwise. My own father was the same, about a partner in the lace trade who cheated him for years before anyone thought to add the figures properly. Love is not foolish for being slow to suspect. It is only foolish if it refuses to look, once the suspicion is finally placed before it plainly. Then let us find out precisely what else he has written into the running of this house that neither of us has troubled to read, Gideon said, and reached for the bottom drawer of the estate cabinet before she could answer him. Every paper I have signed these 2 years, every lease, every account, every clause tucked at the foot of a page I did not trouble to finish. I want to see all of it, and I want to see it before he learns that we are looking. It took the better part of that first day merely to sort the papers into some order that made sense. Leases here, supply contracts there, correspondence in a third pile that grew taller than either of the others by noon. Gideon worked at the desk with his sleeves turned back and a pen scratching steadily at a fresh sheet of foolscap, noting every discrepancy he found in a hand grown sharper and steadier as the hours passed, until Verity thought she could see, quite plainly, the outline of the man Mrs. Yardley had described that morning, beginning to surface through the one the county believed had drowned. I had not realized, Gideon said, some hours into the work, setting down a lease agreement with a frown, quite how many of these tenancy renewals bear Edgar's signature as witness, rather than my own agent's. He has made himself indispensable to the running of this estate, in a manner I ought to have questioned years ago, and did not, because questioning it would have meant admitting how little of my own affairs I had troubled to keep watch over. A man who wishes to be trusted absolutely does not usually announce the wish, Verity said. He simply makes himself useful in 100 small ways, until the trust has been given before anyone thought to ask whether it was earned. My father trusted his own bookkeeper the same way for 20 years, and it very nearly ruined him before anyone thought to check the man's arithmetic. Was the bookkeeper dishonest? No, Verity said. Merely careless, and too proud to admit it, once the carelessness had compounded past correcting. It is not always malice that undoes a man's trust, Sir Gideon. Sometimes it is only that no one troubled to look, for long enough that looking eventually became unbearable to imagine. Gideon considered this in silence for a moment, turning his pen over in his fingers. I wonder sometimes whether my cousin began this business from malice at all, or whether it grew, slowly, out of some smaller and more forgivable resentment, until it had become too large to turn back from, without admitting everything he had already done. Does it matter which? Verity asked, now that the size of it is what it is? No, Gideon admitted. I suppose it does not. I find myself wishing to understand it all the same. I do not think a man stops wanting to understand his own family merely because that family has stopped deserving the wanting. There was a small sound at the study door just then, the particular soft scrape of a boot drawn back too slowly, and when Gideon called out, sharply, "Who's there?" a young footman named Sedgwick put his head round the frame with a bow so prompt it looked rehearsed, and said only that he had come to ask whether the fire wanted building up, and had not liked to interrupt. Gideon told him the fire would do very well as it was, and the door closed again, and neither Gideon nor Verity remarked upon it further just then, though Verity found she remembered the man's face rather more clearly than she had troubled to remember any other servants in the house. There was a second letter Verity wrote that same night. though she did not mention it to Gideon at once, a shorter one, to her mother in Nottingham, who had written twice already since the wedding with careful, anxious questions folded inside ordinary news of the town, asking nothing outright but making plain, in the spaces between her sentences, that she feared her daughter had been sent into a worse bargain than the one she had escaped. Verity had answered both letters with careful cheerfulness before, unwilling to burden a woman already worn thin with grief and debt, with a fear that had until now been only half proven. Tonight she wrote differently. "Mother," she wrote, "I find matters here are a good deal more complicated than either of us understood when the arrangement was made. But I would have you know that I am not sorry for it, and I am not without allies in facing it. Sir Gideon is not the man Mr. Marchmont described to us in the spring, nor am I the woman he described to Sir Gideon in turn. We have both been rather badly used by the same hand, and we mean to see it answered for. I will write again when there is more to tell, and you are not to worry in the meantime beyond what is sensible, which I know is asking a great deal of you, but I ask it all the same, because I love you, and because I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am not unhappy here." Mrs. Fenwick's reply, when it came a week later, was shorter than her daughter's letter, and blotted in one corner in a way that suggested it had been written through tears. The writer had not troubled to wipe away before the ink dried. "You were always the braver of the two of us, my dear," it read. "Your father would have been proud to see you standing your ground, whatever ground it turns out to be. Write when you can, and do not spare me the difficult parts merely to save my nerves. I have buried worse than nerves this past year, and I find I would rather know the whole of a thing than be protected from half of it. I am well enough, and Mrs. Ashworth next door has been very kind about the coal." Verity kept that letter folded inside her own writing case for a long while afterward, and did not show it to Gideon, though she thought, once or twice in the weeks that followed, that he had noticed her reading it, and had been considerate enough not to ask what it contained. There was a particular comfort, she found, in carrying a private grief alongside a shared one, as though the two griefs, kept separately, somehow made each other more bearable than either would have been carried alone. It was well past dark by the time the day's sorting was done. The household settled into the particular quiet of a country house at the end of a long working day. Mrs. Yardley's footsteps below stairs, the last of the fires being banked for the night, an owl somewhere out past the stable, calling to another across the dark fields. Verity, folding the last of the papers away into a hiding place behind a shelf of her late father-in-law's agricultural journals, a room Edgar had never once, so far as either of them could discover, troubled himself to enter, found that she was smiling, in a small grim way that surprised her. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "Only that I came to this house believing myself entirely alone in it," she said. "And I find 3 days married, that I am rather less alone than I expected to be." 3 days, Gideon repeated, and something crossed his face that might, in a man less careful of himself, have been called wonder. "It feels a good deal longer than that already. Is that a complaint, Sir Gideon?" "No," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had begun, without quite deciding to watch for. "I don't believe it is." They had scarcely finished hiding the day's findings back among the ordinary papers when the sound of hooves came up the drive, unhurried and confident, and Mrs. Yardley appeared in the study doorway a moment later with a face gone carefully blank. "Mr. Edgar Marchmont, my lady, come to pay his respects," he says on his way through to Grantham. Verity did not so much as glance at the half-hidden settlement papers before she rose, smoothed her skirts, and arranged her features into something soft and faintly overwhelmed. The very picture of a bride still finding her feet in a house too grand for her. By the time Edgar came through the door with his hat already in his hand, and his smile already fixed in place, she was crossing the room toward him with both hands outstretched, as though he were the one relation in the world she had been longing to see. "Mr. Marchmont, how good of you to call. I've been meaning to thank you properly for the trouble you took over our settlement, such careful, thorough work. I understand from Sir Gideon, though I confess most of the legal language is quite beyond me. The settlement was drawn with your welfare very much in mind, Lady Marchmont," he said, bowing over her hand. "I trust you are settling in comfortably?" "Very comfortably indeed," Verity said, with a small, grateful laugh that cost her nothing at all to produce. Sir Gideon has been explaining the running of the estate to me only this morning. I confess it is a great deal for a manufacturer's daughter to take in all at once, but he has been very patient with my questions. She felt, rather than saw, Gideon's attention sharpened from across the room, and did not look at him. Has he? Edgar said, and his gaze moved past her to his cousin, mild and assessing. I am glad to hear it, cousin. You've seemed rather occupied of late. I hear from Sedgwick buried in the old accounts. Is that right? I hope you are not troubling yourself past what's wise. There's no need for it, you know. I am entirely at your service, whenever the figures grow tiresome. I find I have missed the figures rather more than I realized, Gideon said, his voice perfectly even. A man ought to know his own affairs, Edgar. I have been remiss in that regard, and I mean to mend it. A brief silence followed, in which Verity watched Edgar's smile hold steady, while something behind it worked to absorb the sentence. Of course, he said at last. Very right, too. He turned back to Verity with the warmth restored to his face like a lamp relit. I hope you'll call on me, Lady Marchmont, should you ever find the county dull. You are too good, Mr. Marchmont, Verity said, and meant silently, every word of it in a sense he did not intend. He stayed a bare quarter of an hour longer, spoke of the weather and the harvest, and took his leave with every appearance of a man entirely satisfied with what he had seen. When the sound of his horse had faded down the drive, Verity let the softness drop from her face all at once, like a mask set down after a long evening's performance. He mentioned Sedgwick again, she said, as though the two of them speak of us regularly. They do, Gideon said grimly, or Edgar would not have known what we were about before I had told him myself. He looked at the closed door for a long moment. We shall need to be more careful than we have been, Lady Marchmont. It appears my cousin has ears in this house that neither of us placed there. Then let him listen, Verity said. We shall simply have to give him nothing worth hearing, until the day we are ready for him to hear it all at once. Michaelmas fell that year on a bright, cold Saturday, and Gideon announced at breakfast, with the particular gruffness of a man committing himself to something before he could think better of it, that he intended to attend the harvest fair in the village, as his father had always done, and that Verity might come or not as she pleased, though he rather hoped she would. You have not attended it these 2 years, Mrs. Yardley observed, setting down the coffee with rather more force than the cup strictly required, in the manner of a woman registering approval without permitting herself to say so outright. No, Gideon agreed, I have not. I find I am tired of the things I have not done these 2 years, Mrs. Yardley, and mean to make a rather shorter list of them before the winter closes in. The fair itself was a modest affair by the standards of better years, the stalls fewer than the old men remembered from before the bad harvests, but there was cider, and a fiddler, and a greasy pole with a leg of mutton tied at its top that half the parish's young men had already failed to reach by the time the Marchmont gig drew up at the green. Gideon's arrival caused precisely the stir. Verity had expected heads turning, a ripple of whispered comment running through the crowd, but it was, she noticed with some relief, a different quality of stir than the one that had followed them at their own wedding. Curiosity, certainly, but curiosity without the cruel edge of expectation that a man ought to fail at something merely for their entertainment. Obadiah Slate found them within a quarter hour, a broad, weathered tenant farmer of some 60 years, whose family had held the home farm since Gideon's grandfather's time, his wife on his arm, and both his grown sons trailing behind with the particular sheepishness of young men recently defeated by a greasy pole, and greeted Gideon with a bow that was rather more than the courtesy required, and rather less than the deference the old order of things might once have demanded. Good to see you out among us, Sir Gideon, Slate said. Been too long a while. So I am told by rather more people than I expected to mind the difference, Gideon said, and there was real warmth in it, entirely unguarded, of a kind Verity had seen from him perhaps twice before in the fortnight since her arrival. Your father used to judge the preserves himself. Every Michaelmas without fail, Slate's wife put in, a small round-faced woman with flour still dusting one sleeve. Said a man who couldn't be troubled to taste his own tenants' honest work oughtn't call himself a landlord at all. We've missed the tasting these 2 years past, if I'm honest, Sir Gideon, more than I like to say to a gentleman's face. Then you shall have it back, Gideon said, starting this very afternoon, though I confess my palate for damson preserve has grown rather rusty from disuse. Slate's eldest son, a broad-shouldered young man of perhaps 20, who had inherited his father's steady manner along with his father's build, spoke up then with a boldness that surprised his own mother, judging by the sharp look she gave him. "Beg pardon, Sir Gideon, but it does the whole parish good to see you out and about again. Some of us had begun to wonder whether you meant to shut yourself up in that house for good." "Tom," his mother said, in the particular tone of a woman who has raised a son with more honesty than tact. "He is not wrong to say it," Gideon said, before the young man could be further chastised. "I had very nearly decided the same thing myself, once or twice these 2 years past. I find I have changed my mind about it rather recently, and for reasons I am still working out how to explain properly, even to myself." They stayed the better part of 2 hours, Gideon exchanging news of the harvest with tenants he had not spoken to directly in 2 years, Verity finding herself drawn into a lively dispute among 3 farmers' wives over whose preserves deserved the fair's small prize ribbon. It was in the middle of this dispute, standing at a stall selling bottled fruit and honey, that Verity heard a name spoken behind her that stopped her breath in her chest. Course the corn factor's changed his terms again. This quarter, one farmer was telling another, over a cup of cider. "Marsh and Enderby out of Grantham. Same as always, though I hear tell they've a London agent now besides, handling the finer credit for the bigger accounts. Fellow named Price. Sharp as a tack, they say, and not overly particular where the money comes from before it goes into his books." Verity turned slowly and asked, in a voice she kept carefully light, "Forgive me, did you say a Mr. Price of London? That's him, my lady. Handles a good deal of the northern trade, I believe, wool and lace both, though I couldn't say for certain." She said nothing further, but the name sat in her chest like a stone, dropped into still water, sending its rings out long after the stone itself had settled. Price. She had heard that name before, in her father's own study, in the last terrible spring of his life, spoken by a clerk who had come from London with papers that ended, in the end, in her father's grave. She remembered the day clearly, her father seated at his own desk, a desk he had built himself as a young man before the frames had ever turned a profit, going gray as he read a letter demanding immediate settlement of a debt he had believed. Until that morning, he had another full year to discharge. Mr. Price, of a certain banking house, who had bought up the greater part of Josiah Fenwick's debt at a fraction of its worth, and pressed for its settlement with a patience that had felt at the time almost like cruelty for its own sake patience, she understood now, of a man who had known precisely how long to wait before applying the final pressure. She remembered, too, the particular quality of her father's silence in the weeks that followed, a silence that had frightened her a good deal more than any argument or tears might have done, because it was the silence of a man who had stopped believing there was any point in fighting a thing he could not name. She had not understood at the time why he had never once spoken the name of the party who had bought his debts, only referring to them as the London interest, as though naming a thing gave it more power over him than leaving it nameless. She understood it rather better now, having watched her own husband spend 2 years calling his own weakness an injury rather than a design, because a design, once named, demands to be fought, and a man exhausted by grief does not always have the fighting left in him. There was a particular memory that returned to her now, standing amid the fair's noise and color, that she had not thought of in months. Her father, some weeks before his death, taking her hand across his desk and saying, with a weariness that had frightened her more than any illness could have, that he was sorry, that he had wanted to leave her something more than debts, and a good name nobody in Nottingham troubled to remember any longer. She had told him then that his good name was worth more to her than any fortune, and she had believed it, and believed it still. But standing here now, with the shape of Edgar's design finally becoming clear to her, she found herself wondering how much of her father's weariness, how much of his silent surrender, had been engineered quite as deliberately as the ruin that followed it. She found Gideon a few minutes later and drew him a little apart from the crowd, her voice low. "The corn factor your estate deals through Marsh and Enderby of Grantham. Do you know whether they employ a London agent by the name of Price?" Gideon's brow furrowed. I could not say offhand why. Because a Mr. Price, of a London banking house, is the man who bought up my father's debts in Nottingham in the last year of his life and pressed them until it broke him. If the same name sits behind both your cousin's dealings and my father's ruin, Sir Gideon, then whatever brought Edgar to my mother's parlor was rather less a matter of chance charity than either of us has believed. Gideon was quiet a long moment, the noise of the fair going on around them, oblivious. If you are right, he said finally, then my cousin did not merely find a convenient bride in a moment of misfortune. He went looking for a particular kind of misfortune, using a man he already trusted with his own money, and had that man deliver it to your father's door on his behalf. That is not opportunism, Verity. That is manufacture. Yes, Verity said. I believe it is. I am sorry, he said again, after a moment, though I begin to understand that the word does very little to mend what it describes. It does something, Verity said. Not enough, but something. I would rather have your sorrow, honestly given, than none at all, Sir Gideon, even knowing it cannot undo a single thing that has already been done. They walked back toward the gig in a silence that had grown, over the course of the afternoon, into something considerably less strained than the silence they had arrived with, and Gideon, helping her up into her seat, held her hand a moment longer than the courtesy strictly required, though neither of them remarked upon it. They rode home from the fair with the question sitting between them unresolved, and it was 2 days before Blackwood, written to in haste, with only the bare facts of the name and the request that he make what inquiries he was able, sent back a reply that answered rather more than either of them had thought to ask. Mr. Price, it transpired, was indeed the London agent for Marsh and Enderby's northern accounts, and had been so these 6 years past, and Blackwood's clerk, making discreet inquiries at the Nottingham end of the business, had turned up a detail that made Verity's hands go cold as she read it aloud to Gideon. In the library that evening, the purchase of Josiah Fenwick's debts, the spring before his death, had been arranged on the instruction of a private client, whose name did not appear on the transaction itself, but whose correspondence with Mr. Price, preserved in the bank's own letter books, was signed simply E. M. He did not merely find a ruined family and see an opportunity in it, Gideon said slowly, once the full weight of the thing had settled. He went looking for one. He had dealings with this Price already, through the same corn factor that handles my own estate's business, and when he needed a bride poor enough and grateful enough to serve his purpose, he did not wait for one to present itself. He went to a man he already trusted with his own money and asked him to find one, and Price, knowing my father's debts were already circling toward ruin, pointed him toward Nottingham. Verity said, her voice very steady, in the particular way she had of speaking most calmly when she felt the least calm within. My father did not simply fail, Sir Gideon. He was selected to fail by the same hand that has been bleeding your own estate these 2 years, so that his daughter might be delivered, poor and grateful, into precisely the marriage your cousin required. Gideon was quiet a long moment. I am sorry, he said finally. I do not know what use an apology is 3 months after the fact, but I am sorry all the same that my family's greed reached as far as your father's grave before either of us ever met. Don't, Verity said, not unkindly. I did not come here for an apology, and I have found I have very little use for one, however honestly meant. I came here to see it answered for. Let us do that instead. It was some nights after this that Verity, unable to sleep, walked the darkened upper passage toward the old schoolroom, at the end of the east wing, a room she had passed a dozen times without curiosity, its door generally kept closed, and found, quite by accident, a thin line of candlelight showing beneath it. She pushed the door open, expecting Mrs. Yardley about some late household business, and found instead Gideon alone, one hand braced against a pair of parallel bars fashioned crudely from old broom handles and lashed between 2 chairs, sweat standing on his brow, in the act of lowering himself, with visible and considerable effort, back into his own chair. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The room around them still held the ghost of its old purpose, a child's slate propped against one wall, a globe gone dusty on its stand, a low bookshelf that Verity guessed, correctly, had once held Gideon's own boyhood lesson books, and perhaps his father's before him. I did not mean for anyone to see this. Gideon said at last, his voice rough with more than exertion. How long, Verity asked. Have you been building bar contraptions out of broom handles in an empty schoolroom at midnight? 18 months, near enough. Since some months after the accident. Not this precise arrangement. Yardley's brother rigged the bars for me some while back, when I asked him for something sturdier than a broom handle, and not a word of explanation besides. He looked down at his own hands, gripping the makeshift rail. The county believes me a wreck, who will never rise from that chair again. My own physician believes it, and tells me so, with a gentleness I have come to find rather harder to bear than plain unkindness would be. I have found it useful, on the whole, to let them go on believing it. Because a man who believes himself finished stops watching the door, Verity said, understanding all at once. And a man who stops watching the door makes mistakes. Gideon looked up at her, something unguarded moving across his face before he could think to hide it away again. Yes, he said, precisely that. My father used to say the most dangerous man in any room was the one everyone had already decided posed no danger at all. I did not understand him when I was young enough to hear it and not need it. I understand him a great deal better now. Have you gained any ground in 18 months? Some. Slowly. Dr. Thorne tells me the injury was severe enough that I ought not to expect a great deal more than I have already managed, and I confess I had begun, before you came, to believe him entirely. He was quiet a moment. It is a strange thing to find oneself uncertain, a fortnight into a marriage neither party chose, whether one's own doctor has been telling the truth about anything at all. Then perhaps, Verity said carefully, when this business with your cousin is settled, we ought to ask a second physician's opinion. A man from outside the county, with no cause to have formed any prior opinion of you either way. Perhaps, Gideon said, and something in the way he said it suggested the idea had taken root rather more firmly than his tone let on. Will you tell anyone what you have seen tonight? No, Verity said, though I confess I should like to come again, if you would permit it, not to help you stand, for I understand that is not what you want of me, but simply so that the counting need not be done entirely alone. Gideon considered this for a long moment, the candle guttering low between them. I think, he said finally, that I should like that a good deal, though I have not been asked such a thing in a manner that did not feel like pity in a very long while, and I find I do not quite know how to receive it without flinching. Then don't receive it as pity, Verity said, because it isn't offered as such. Receive it as company, which is a different thing entirely, and asks nothing of you but that you allow it to sit in the room. She did not mention the schoolroom to anyone else, and neither did he, though she noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he no longer troubled to lock the door quite so carefully behind him, as though some small part of the secrecy had already served its purpose, and could at last be set down. The estate's condition, once Verity had leisure to look at it properly, told its own quiet story of the hard years just past. The harvest of the year before had failed nearly everywhere in the kingdom, a summer that never truly came. The old men in the villages said, the sky sat gray from June to September, and the corn stood thin and pale in fields that should have stood gold, and though the harvest lately gathered had been kinder, the county had not yet recovered its footing. Bread stood dear under the tariff that kept foreign corn from the market, and the price of homegrown corn correspondingly high, a state of affairs that suited a landowner's rents very well and suited very little else. She thought often, in those weeks, of her father's own workshop in the years before its ruin, the clatter of the frames from dawn until dusk, the particular smell of tallow and hot metal that had clung to her father's coat every evening of her childhood, and the pride he had taken, foolish and unshakable, in a trade that had provided honestly for 3 generations before the war and the frame-breaking both conspired to end it. She remembered him teaching her, at 11 years old, to read a ledger properly, not merely to add the figures, but to ask what each figure represented, and whether the story it told matched the story a man wished it to tell. It is not enough to trust the sum, Verity, he had said, more than once, with the particular patience of a man who believed his daughter's mind deserved as much cultivating as any son's might have. A column of correct figures can still tell a lie, if a man is careful enough about which figures he chooses to include in it. She had not understood, at 11, why he troubled to teach a girl such things at all, when no lace trade ledger would ever be legally hers to keep. She understood it a good deal better now, sitting in a Lincolnshire library with her husband's estate accounts spread across her knees than she ever had in her father's own workroom. She said as much to Gideon one evening. Late in the library, the fire burned down to embers, and both of them too deep in the day's work to notice the cold creeping into the room. If Price has been circling ruined families the way he circled my father's, there may be others in this county besides myself who have felt his hand without ever knowing his name for it. Slate would know, Gideon said. If any tenant hereabouts has had dealings with a factor's agent pressing too hard on a debt, he will have heard of it, even if it never touched his own farm directly. He set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment in a way that made her suddenly conscious of how close together their two chairs had drawn over the course of a fortnight's shared labor. My father used to say that the surest way to know a man's character was to watch how he behaved toward those with no power to punish him for behaving badly. He never once raised a rent in a hard year, whatever his agent advised him. He sounds as though he was a good man. He was a great deal better than I have been these last 2 years. Gideon looked down at his own hands. I let a stranger circle my own tenants in my name and called it none of my business, because I had decided I had no business left worth minding. You have it now, Verity said, and reached across the small space between their chairs to lay her hand briefly over his, where it rested on the arm of the chair, not the careful, testing touch of a woman offering comfort to an invalid, but something plainer than that, a hand simply covering another hand, because the moment seemed to call for it. He did not pull away. Neither of them remarked upon it. After a moment, she withdrew her hand again and reached for the next paper in the pile, and the work went on. It was a small thing, that touch, scarcely worth remarking upon in the grand scheme of hidden clauses and financial ruin they were still unraveling. But Verity found, in the days that followed, that she thought of it rather more often than the moment's brevity seemed to warrant the particular warmth of his hand beneath hers, the way he had gone very still rather than pulling away, as though stillness itself were the only language he had left for a feeling he had not yet learned to name aloud. It was Obadiah Slate, in the end, who gave them the thread that led toward Hollow Lane, though not in the manner either of them expected. He came to the hall himself one gray morning, hat in hand, having walked the better part of 2 miles, rather than wait for a message to be carried, and would not sit until he had said his piece. Mrs. Yardley showed him into the library rather than the servants' hall, a small courtesy that was not lost on Slate, who turned his hat over twice in his big weathered hands before he spoke, as though gathering the words the way a man gathers his nerve before a cold plunge. "I've been asking about, quiet-like, since you spoke to me of your cousin's dealings," he said. "Man in my position hears things a gentleman don't, sometimes, on account of nobody troubling to watch their tongue in front of a farmer. There's talk in the village, Sir Gideon, that's been sitting wrong with me since I first heard it, near 2 years back, and never had cause to repeat it to anyone until now." "Go on," Gideon said. "Old Coop, the saddler in the village, does the harness work for half the county, your own stable included. He mentioned once, over a pint at the Marchmont Arms, not long after your accident, that he'd been asked some weeks before to look over a girth strap brought to him by one of your own men, and told to weaken the stitching along one seam, quiet-like, and say nothing of it, on account of it being wanted for a training exercise your father used to practice on young horses, testing whether a green animal would stand steady if the tack failed sudden-like beneath it. Coop thought nothing of it at the time. Your father had done such things years back, and it weren't Coop's place to question a Marchmont's orders passed on through a servant. "Why did you not come to me with this sooner, Obadiah?" Gideon asked, not unkindly, though the question plainly cost something to ask. "Because 2 years ago, Sir Gideon, forgive my plainness, you were not a man who wanted visitors, nor questions, nor much of anything beyond being left alone with your grief. I judged it would do more harm than good, bringing you an old tavern tale with no proof behind it, when you were barely holding together as it was. I've regretted the judgment rather more these past weeks than I care to say." "You judged rightly, given the man I was then," Gideon said. "I am glad you judge otherwise of the man I am now." Gideon had gone very still. Which man brought him the strap? He couldn't say for certain, not being well acquainted with your household staff, but he described him near enough slight, built, quick-walking, forward-leaning, the sort of fellow always seeming half in a hurry. I believe you've a footman answering that description yourself, Sir Gideon. Sedgwick, I think he's called. Verity felt the name land in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. You believe the girth on Sir Gideon's own saddle was deliberately weakened. I believe, Slate said carefully, that a strap treated so would hold well enough under ordinary riding, and give way sudden and complete under any harder strain a startled horse rearing, say, or coming up sharp over rough ground in poor light. And I believe a girth failing beneath a rider at speed on Hollow Lane, in the dark, would account for a fall a good deal worse than any horse merely shying at a noise. 2 years I have kept that man in my own household, Gideon said. Once Slate had gone, his voice gone low and hard. Fed him at my own table in a manner of speaking. Trusted him with errands I never troubled to question. He came into this household some months before my accident, hired, I was told at the time, on Edgar's recommendation, to ease the burden on Mrs. Yardley while my father's health was failing. I never once thought to question the timing of it, nor to wonder why a footman recommended for indoor service should have occasion to carry a saddle strap to the village at all. You could not have suspected a servant you had no cause to distrust, Verity said. That is rather the whole design of it. I think never asking any one person to do more than a single smallful thing, so that no single person ever sees the whole shape of what they have helped to build. Your cousin did not need Sedgwick to understand the plan. He needed only a man willing to carry a strap to a saddler and say nothing further about it. We shall need Coop's account taken down properly, Gideon said, and I shall want to examine the saddle itself if it has not long since been replaced. It had not. The old saddle, cracked and disused, still hung in a corner of the tack room, and when Gideon and the head groom, a taciturn man named Marsh, who had served the family since Gideon's boyhood, examined the girth strap together that same afternoon. The mended stitching along one seam was plain enough to the eye once a man knew to look for it old work, competently done, but done unmistakably, to disguise a repair rather than to prevent one. I ought to have noticed it myself, Sir Gideon, Marsh said, turning the old strap over in his weathered hands with an expression of genuine distress. I checked that tack regular as clockwork, same as I've checked every piece of harness in this stable 30 year. But a stitched seam looks like a stitched seam to a man not looking for foul play in particular, and I never once thought to look for it. No man would, Gideon said. That is rather the whole cruelty of the design. It asks nothing suspicious of anyone who is not already looking for treachery, and men do not generally go looking for treachery in their own stable, from a family they have served their whole lives. I'll swear to what I've seen today before any magistrate you like, Sir Gideon, Marsh added, still turning the strap over, as though he could not quite make himself set it down. 30 year I've kept this stable, and never once thought I'd live to see the day a Marchmont turned his hand against another Marchmont through so cowardly a means as a weakened strap in the dark. Nor did I, Gideon said quietly. I confess I am still learning to believe it myself, some mornings, though the proof stands before me plain enough. They rode back from the tack room in a silence that had a different weight to it than any that had passed between them before, the ordinary business of a marriage settlement's suspicious clauses having given way, all at once, to something considerably darker. Gideon was quiet a long while before he spoke again. I think of Waterloo more than I let anyone know, he said, apropos of nothing Verity had asked. Not the charge itself, though God knows that comes back to me too, at odd hours. I think of the hour before it, mostly. Standing my horse in a line of other horses, in a field gone to mud from 3 days' rain, waiting for an order that might come in a minute, or might come in an hour, and having no power at all to hasten it. I did not feel brave in that hour. I felt entirely ordinary, and rather sick with waiting. He glanced at her sidelong. I have thought of that field a great deal these 2 years past, lying in a chair instead of standing in a stirrup. I believe I have spent most of that time waiting for an order that was never going to come from outside myself. Has it come now? Verity asked quietly. I believe it came the morning. You read me that clause at the foot of the 9th page. Gideon said, and asked me to what end a man would go to such trouble over a bride's own portion. I did not recognize it as an order at the time. I recognize it now. He did not merely wait for an accident to serve his purpose. Gideon said that evening, his voice gone flat in the particular way Verity had come to recognize as the sound of a man holding himself together by main force. He arranged for 1 week in advance through a servant of his own placing, and dressed it up afterward as an act of God rather than a deliberate hand. We shall need more than a saddler's memory and a stitched seam to prove intention, Verity said gently, but without softening the truth of the matter. A court will want more than that before it calls a man a would-be murderer. But it is a beginning, and it is the first thread that leads somewhere Edgar cannot easily explain away. Gideon was quiet a long moment, staring at his own hands as though seeing them for the first time in some new and unwelcome light. I have spent 2 years believing my legs failed me through no one's fault but chance and a startled horse, he said. I do not know which is the harder thing to carry, believing oneself simply unlucky, or knowing oneself deliberately chosen for ruin by a man who once taught you to ride. Neither is easy, Verity said, but I think, in the end, you will find the second easier to fight than the first. A man cannot make war upon bad luck, Sir Gideon. He can make war upon a man. Something in Gideon's face shifted at that, not quite a smile, but the shadow of resolve settling into place where grief had been sitting a moment before. Then let us make war upon him properly, he said, and see how well he fares against an enemy who is finally troubled to look at what he built. It was Dr. Ambrose Frobisher, sent for from London on the strength of Gideon's own growing doubts about his physician's honesty, who gave them the second thread, though he arrived expecting to confirm an injury's ordinary limits rather than to uncover a design against it. He was a small, precise man with iron-gray whiskers, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned early in his profession that haste killed more patients than disease ever managed alone, and he arrived at Marchmont Hall, having traveled the better part of 2 days by post-chaise without complaint, remarking only that the Lincolnshire roads were rather worse than London's, which he supposed was to be expected of a county that grew more corn than it built turnpikes. He spent 2 full hours alone with Gideon behind the closed library door, while Verity sat in the passage outside, and did not pretend to occupy herself with anything else at all, and when the door opened at last, his face told her a good deal before he spoke a single word. Lady Marchmont, he said, drawing off his spectacles and polishing them with a corner of his coat, in the manner of a man ordering his thoughts before committing them to speech. Your husband is not a man whose faculties are declining, nor whose recovery has reached any natural limit. The muscular response in the injured limbs, the general constitution of the man, the strength remaining in the upper body, none of it accords with an injury 18 months settled into its final shape. I would go so far as to say the pattern I observe today is more consistent with a man whose recovery has been actively retarded by some outside agent than with one whose body has simply done all the healing it is capable of. Retarded by what manner of agent? Verity asked, though some part of her had already begun to guess. That I cannot say from examination alone, Frobisher said. But I have treated a good many convalescents in 30 years of practice, and I know the particular heaviness a sustained dose of laudanum leaves upon a man's limbs and his temper both, even when the dose falls short of doing him any dramatic harm. Your husband exhibits certain of those signs still, faintly, though he tells me his current physician prescribes the compound only sparingly, for pain. Gideon, when pressed, could name the tonic Thorne had prescribed him these 18 months, a dark, bitter draught taken nightly, and it was Mrs. Yardley asked to fetch the apothecary's account book kept in the still room for household remedies, who provided the piece that turned suspicion into something considerably harder. I've kept this book myself, my lady, these 10 year and more, she said, laying it open on the library table. Every bottle that comes into this house from the apothecary in the village is entered here, with what it cost and what it was wanted for. I'll own, I never troubled to add the figures for Sir Gideon's own tonic, not thinking it my place to question a doctor's prescribing. But you're welcome to add them yourself if you've a mind to. Verity did that same evening, tracing the entries for Gideon's nightly draft, back across 18 months, the columns of figures growing longer and more damning the further back she went. until the full tally sat before her, stark and undeniable in misses. Yardley's own careful hand, a quantity of laudanum, purchased for a single patient's use that exceeded, by a considerable margin, anything Frobisher considered reasonable for the management of ordinary pain. 3 times what a man in your condition ought to require, Frobisher said, when the full tally was shown to him the following morning. Sustained at that level for 18 months, it would produce precisely the heaviness, the slowness of limb and temper that I observed in you yesterday, without ever rising to a quantity a coroner would call dangerous in itself. It is, if I may say so, a very carefully calculated cruelty, enough to keep a man weak, never quite enough to kill him, nor to raise an alarm in an apothecary too accustomed to filling the same prescription to think twice about the sum of it. Thorne has been dosing me like a man fattening a beast for a fair, Gideon said, his voice perfectly flat, keeping me weak enough to serve my cousin's purposes, and not 1 grain weaker than that. We shall need Thorne's own testimony, or failing that, his flight, to prove the intention behind it, Verity said. A quantity of laudanum, however excessive, might yet be argued an honest physician's error. We shall want to know whether he acted alone, or at another's direction. I do not believe, Gideon said slowly, that Elias Thorne has had an original thought regarding my treatment in 18 months that did not first pass through my cousin's mouth. He was my father's physician before he was ever mine, Verity. He brought me into this world with his own hands, or so my mother always told the story. I do not know how a man reconciles that history with what he has since done to me, and I find I do not much wish to ask him when the time comes. I would rather hear it from a magistrate's mouth than his own. Frobisher had already opened his bag and drawn out a sealed document, his written findings on Gideon's true physical condition, prepared, he said, before either of them had thought to ask for it. A physician who waits to be asked for the obvious thing is not much use to anyone, Lady Marchmont. I rather suspected, before I had finished my examination, that you would want this in writing, and soon. Gideon was very quiet that evening, sitting at the library table with his own hands spread flat before him, staring at nothing in particular. 18 months of tonics and draughts, he said at last, half to himself, given by a man who sat at my bedside for 3 days after the accident and told me, with tears standing in his own eyes so far as I could tell, that he had hope for my recovery. I thanked him for it, Verity, at every visit. He sat by my bed for 3 days after the accident, Gideon said again, as though the fact would not settle properly into place, no matter how many times he turned it over. I remember his hand on my wrist, taking my pulse, and I remember thinking, even through the fever, that I was glad of him. I do not know what to do with that memory, now that I know what the hand belonged to. You do not have to know what to do with it tonight, Verity said, only that it was real, once whatever it has since turned out to mean. Grief for a thing that was never quite what it seemed is still grief, Gideon. I buried my own father, believing a kindness had been done my family, and learned only after that the kindness was a trap laid for both of us. It does not make the grief less true. It only makes it more complicated to carry. You are not lost time, Verity said. You are simply time that has not yet happened. There is a difference, and I mean to see that you learn it, whatever else this business costs either of us, before it is finished. We shall need Blackwood here in person, Gideon said at last, gathering himself. This is no longer a matter for letters alone. Between Slate's account of the saddle, Coop's testimony, the apothecary's own figures, and Frobisher's written opinion, we have the beginnings of a case no county magistrate could easily wave aside, but a beginning is not a finished thing, and Edgar will not stand still while we finish it. No, Verity agreed. He will not, which means we had better move a good deal faster than he expects us to. There was a third matter, smaller than the other two, but no less troubling for its size, that came to light in the days before Blackwood's arrival, when Verity, cross-referencing the apothecary's figures against the household's ordinary accounts, noticed that Sedgwick's own wages had been paid, for the better part of 2 years, at a rate considerably higher than any other footman in the house, the difference quietly absorbed into a general household expenses column that no one, in the ordinary run of things, would ever have thought to question. He was not merely following orders out of loyalty or fear, Verity said, laying the wage book before Gideon. He was paid for it, and paid well, in a manner designed to escape notice, precisely because it was buried among 100 ordinary entries for coal and candles and kitchen linen. Then he is not merely a servant who did as he was told, Gideon said slowly. He is a man who understood, at least in some part, what he was being paid to do, and did it anyway, for money enough to make the doing worth his conscience. We shall want him found and questioned, alongst Thorn, Verity said. Though I confess I hold rather less sympathy for a man paid to weaken a saddle strap than for a physician talked into it by a patient's own cousin. A physician may plead he was persuaded against his better judgment. A footman paid double wages to carry a strap to a saddler, and say nothing of it has rather less room to claim he did not understand the nature of the business. Perhaps, Gideon said, though I find I have grown rather less certain these past weeks of how much any man truly understands about the harm he does, when the harm is broken into pieces small enough that no single piece looks like harm at all. Sedgwick, when Gideon sent to have him brought before the housekeeper's room for questioning that same evening, was nowhere to be found, his room stripped of his few belongings, and Mrs. Yardley, white-faced, reported that he had asked leave that very morning to visit a sick mother in Boston, a request she had granted without a second thought, having no cause yet to suspect him of anything beyond the ordinary business of a footman's family concerns. He has run, Gideon said flatly when the news reached him, which tells us, at the very least, that word of our inquiries has already reached further than we hoped it might. Then Edgar knows, Verity said, or suspects enough to have warned his own man to disappear before questions could be put to him directly. Which means, Gideon said, we have rather less time than Blackwood's letter led us to hope. Mr. Reginald Blackwood arrived at Marchmont Hall on a Tuesday, having traveled up from London by post-chaise at a pace that suggested Verity's letters had conveyed rather more urgency than she remembered putting into them. He proved to be a broad, ruddy-faced man of some 50 years, with quick eyes and a voice like a church organ, played not too fast, and he shook Gideon's hand, and then Verity's with equal vigor, before he had so much as removed his greatcoat. Lady Marchmont. Sir Gideon. Your father spoke of me kindly once or twice, Lady Marchmont, in better days for us both. I was sorry to hear of his passing, and sorrier still now, to learn something of the manner of men who profited by it. He set down a battered leather case that appeared, from the way he handled it, to weigh a good deal more than its size suggested. Now, show me everything, all of it. I shall tell you plainly what is usable and what is not, and I will not waste your time being delicate about it. Mrs. Yardley had the best guest room made up, and a fire kept burning in it day and night, and made no secret of her opinion that a London solicitor who could put that particular look of grim satisfaction on Sir Gideon's face was a guest worth keeping comfortable for as long as he cared to stay. Blackwood himself scarcely noticed the comforts offered him, being generally to be found at the library table from breakfast, until well past the hour when Mrs. Yardley judged it proper to bring in a final tray of cold meat and bread and leave it without comment. It took the better part of 2 days. Blackwood read through the marriage settlement with a series of small, dissatisfied noises, tracing the trustee clause and the discretionary powers it granted Edgar with visible distaste. He read Coop, the saddler's account, taken down and witnessed properly before a local justice of the peace, twice through. He read the apothecary's figures against Frobisher's written opinion, and set the two side by side with evident satisfaction, the way a man sets aside a tool he has been searching for and is glad to find close to hand. And he read, last of all, the correspondence Blackwood's own clerk had traced between Mr. Price and the initials E.M. regarding the purchase of Josiah Fenwick's debts. Your cousin, he remarked once, halfway through the second day, without looking up from a column of figures, has built himself a rather more elaborate design than the ordinary greedy relation, Sir Gideon. Most such men are content to wait on a death, or to forge a single document and hope it holds. Yours has built a financial architecture, 2 years in the construction, reaching into a marriage settlement, a physician's prescribing book, and the ruin of a family 3 counties distant, all in service of the same single end. I confess I have rarely seen its like, and I have been 40 years at this profession. Is there precedent for it? Verity asked. A case resembling this one that might guide us as to how a court is likely to view it? There is precedent for pieces of it, Blackwood said. Fraud upon an estate. Certainly I have handled a dozen such matters in my career. Attempted incapacitation through medical means, rather less commonly, though not unheard of where a large inheritance hangs in the balance. But I have not in 40 years seen a single man attempt all three at once, woven together with such patience that no single thread, examined alone, would have seemed quite damning enough to bring before a court. It is only in the seeing of the whole tapestry, Lady Marchmont, that the design becomes undeniable, which is precisely why we must present it as a whole, and not permit your cousin's counsel to pick at one thread in isolation and call the rest coincidence. At the end of the second day, he leaned back in his chair, laced his hands behind his head, and addressed them both. Here is where matters stand, he said. You have documented evidence that your cousin arranged, through a marriage settlement of his own drafting, to secure a second claim upon this family's fortune, entirely separate from the estate itself, contingent on precisely the same finding of incapacity he has spent 2 years laboring to produce. You have the sworn account of a saddler that your own tack was deliberately weakened, at the instruction of a man in your cousin's employ, in the days before an accident that very nearly killed you that, gentleman and lady, is no longer merely a civil matter at all. That is attempted murder, and it will be treated as such once it is properly laid before the right authority. And you have a physician's written opinion, corroborated by your own household's apothecary accounts, that your recovery has been deliberately retarded by excessive dosing, sustained over 18 months, for the express purpose of supporting an incapacity your cousin already intended to allege before this marriage was ever arranged. He looked between them. Taken together, this is not a dispute over estate management, whatever your cousin may try to call it if the matter comes to a hearing. This is a conspiracy, sustained over years, to defraud a gentleman of his property and his liberty both, by means that include an attempt upon his very life. Your cousin is not looking at losing a lawsuit, Sir Gideon. He is looking at the gallows, or as near to it as this county's law can bring a man. The word sat in the room like a stone, dropped into still water, and none of them moved to disturb the ripples of it for a long moment. What must we do? Gideon said at last, and how quickly must we do it? First, Blackwood said, we file. Not a complaint waiting on Edgar's next move, but a petition of our own, laid before the Vice-Chancellor's court in London, setting out plainly that you are of sound mind and full possession of your faculties, supported by Dr. Frobisher's opinion, and asking the court to take notice of the fraud already documented against your estate and your marriage both. If your cousin means to bring his own inquisition against you, Sir Gideon, he will find the ground rather less friendly than he expected, for we shall have got there first. And the matter of the saddle, Verity asked, and of Dr. Thorne. Those go to the county magistrate, in the first instance, as matters proper to be examined locally, before any question of a formal criminal charge can be laid, Blackwood said. I shall want Coop's account, and slates confirmed before a justice of the peace with proper formality, and I shall want Dr. Thorne examined, or better yet, confronted, before he has occasion to learn how much we already know, and takes it into his head to disappear. How much time do we have, Gideon asked, before my cousin understands that the ground beneath his own petition has shifted? Less than I would like, Blackwood admitted. A man who has spent 2 years building a case has spent 2 years cultivating informants besides, and I should be surprised if word of my presence in this county has not already reached him through some channel neither of us has troubled to guard. I would advise moving on every front at once, rather than one at a time, the settlement, the saddle, the physician, all filed and witnessed within the same fortnight, so that whatever he hears of one thread, he has no leisure to unravel the others before the court has already taken notice of them. You speak of this as though you have done it before, Verity said. I have done a good many things before, Lady Marchmont, in 40 years of practice, though I own I have rarely seen quite so many threads converge upon a single man's greed as I have found in this county. Blackwood set down his pen and regarded them both for a moment, with an expression that had softened briefly out of its usual brisk efficiency. I will tell you plainly, Because I think you have earned plain speaking. By now, I have handled a great many estates in my career, and buried a great many family quarrels quietly, because the parties concerned preferred a settlement to a scandal. I do not think this is a case for burying. What your cousin has done, he has done with such patience and such calculation that I confess I find myself, at 50 years of age, rather more moved by it than my profession generally permits. What would you have us do in an ideal arrangement of events? Gideon asked. Ideally, Blackwood said, I should like a fortnight I do not expect to have. I should like Thorne's confession fully taken and witnessed, Coop and Slate's depositions formally lodged, and the Vice-Chancellor's petition drafted and ready to file within the same week, so that the moment word reaches your cousin that the ground has shifted, he finds every door already closed rather than merely closing. I have learned in 40 years that a desperate man given time to think is a good deal more dangerous than a desperate man given none at all. Then we shall give him none at all, Verity said. He has not called at the hall in some weeks, Gideon said slowly. I had thought it merely that I no longer required his visits, having sent for Frobisher instead. I had not considered that he might already suspect discovery. Then we had best move on him at once, Blackwood said, before suspicion ripens into flight. Dr. Elias Thorne's house in the market town proved, when Blackwood and a county constable called upon it 2 mornings later, to be shuttered and silent, the physician's man reporting only that his master had gone to attend a sick relation in the north and had left no direction where he might be found. Blackwood set a clerk to making inquiries at every posting house within 20 miles, on the reasoning that a man traveling in haste generally left some trace of his passage. However, he tried to cover it. He is run, Gideon said, reading the report that evening, which tells us a good deal in itself. An innocent man does not generally choose the same week his patient's household begins asking questions to visit a sick relation he has not mentioned in 18 months of regular attendance. No, Blackwood agreed, nor does he generally leave without settling his accounts at the local inn, which I am reliably informed he did not trouble to do. A man in a hurry is a man with something to outrun. It was Obadiah Slate, 2 days after that, who brought them the first sign that Edgar Marchmont had begun to feel the ground shifting beneath him. He came to the hall himself this time, his face set hard, and would not sit until he had said his piece. A man came to my gate last evening, Sir Gideon. Not Mr. Edgar himself, a stranger, well-dressed, very civil, who suggested I might do well to reconsider how deep I meant to involve myself in matters that were, as he put it, properly a family concern and no business of a tenant farmer's. Slate's jaw was set like a man biting down on something he did not care for the taste of. He did not threaten me outright. He is not the sort of man who needs to. But I've had my boys sleeping with the dog in the yard since, and I'll not pretend that's nothing. If this becomes dangerous for your family, Obadiah, I would not ask you to stand in it. Your father came to my father's aid 20 years back, Sir Gideon, when a dispute over the mill leet would have ruined us, and never once asked to be thanked for it after. Slate's voice had gone firm in the particular way of a man arriving at a decision he has already half made. I've been waiting the better part of 2 years to be of some use to this family again, and I'll not be frightened off it now by a smooth-talking stranger at my gate. Tell me what you need of me, and I'll give it plain. Old Coop, too, found himself visited, not threatened outright, but reminded, in a conversation he reported to Gideon with evident discomfort, that a saddler's trade depended a good deal on a gentleman's goodwill, and that certain gentlemen in the county had long memories for tradesmen who spoke too freely of matters better left to their betters. I've mended harness for this family 30 years, Sir Gideon, the old man said, turning his cap in his hands in the hall's entrance passage, plainly uneasy at finding himself received as a guest rather than a tradesman. I'll not be talked out of telling the truth of what was brought to my shop, whatever it costs my custom after. But I'll own I'd sleep easier, knowing the telling of it was wanted soon, rather than left hanging over me a 12-month. It will not be left hanging a 12-month, Gideon told him. You have my word on that, whatever else this business costs either of us. And a letter arrived for Verity, unsealed in a manner that made plain it had been read before it reached her, observing, with great and injurious politeness, that it was very generally understood. Lady Marchmont had married considerably above her station, and that the wisest course for a woman in her position might be to withdraw quietly from public notice. Verity read it through twice, folded it without visible emotion, and added it to the growing file of evidence Blackwood was assembling in London. "It is the same tactic used against my own father," she said, when Gideon asked whether she was troubled by it. "Make a person doubt their own footing, until they remove themselves from ground they had every right to stand on. I do not intend to watch it succeed twice in one family." Blackwood, when the letter reached him by the same post as a full account of the threats against Slate and Coop, wrote back within 2 days with news of his own. His clerk had traced Dr. Thorne as far as a coaching inn in Peterborough, traveling under his own name, and evidently in no great hurry, having perhaps not yet understood how close the net around him had drawn. "He will talk," Gideon said, reading the letter over Verity's shoulder. "A man who runs rather than stands his ground is not a man who means to hang for another's sake." "No," Verity agreed. "He will talk. The question now is whether Edgar knows we are close enough behind him to force his own hand before he is ready for it." Word of Blackwood's presence at the hall and of the growing pile of sworn depositions accumulating in his careful hand had by now begun to travel through the county in the particular slow, unstoppable way that such news always did, carried from kitchen to kitchen and market stall to market stall until it reached ears no one had thought to guard against. Gideon began receiving, in the weeks that followed, a small but steady trickle of callers. He had not summoned a miller from the northern boundary of the estate who had likewise been pressed, some months back, to alter terms on a contract he had never quite understood the need for. A widow with a small holding near Fenn's Cross, who had received a similar visit from a well-dressed stranger, suggesting she reconsider her loyalties, even, on one memorable afternoon, the rector himself, who called ostensibly to discuss the coming winter's poor relief, and remained an hour longer than the subject required to observe, delicately, that he had heard troubling things about Mr. Edgar Marchmont's dealings, and wished Sir Gideon to know that the parish stood rather more firmly behind its own family than certain rumors might have suggested. "They are not afraid of him any longer," Verity said, once the rector had gone. "Or not afraid enough to stay silent, at any rate." "No," Gideon agreed. "I begin to think my cousin mistook 2 years of silence for 2 years of loyalty, when it was, the whole time, merely 2 years of people waiting to see which of us would prove the stronger horse before committing themselves to a side." It is a humbling thing to learn how much of one's own reputation was never truly settled at all, merely held in a kind of patient suspension by neighbors too polite, or too cautious, to say so aloud. They did not have long to wait for an answer to that question, though neither of them, sitting together in the library that evening, with the fire burned low, could have guessed how soon it would come, nor in what shape. Blackwood returned to the hall himself, some days later, to take Coop's and Slate's depositions before a justice of the peace with proper formality, a stern, elderly magistrate named Sir Rowland Ashby, who had known Gideon's father a great many years and listened to both accounts with a gravity that left no doubt he understood their weight. "I have sat on this bench 30 years, Sir Gideon," Ashby said, once the depositions had been signed and witnessed, "and I have heard a great many family quarrels dressed up as legal disputes. I have not, in all that time, heard one quite so cold-bloodedly constructed as the design your cousin appears to have built against you. You have my full support in bringing this before whatever court will hear it fastest." "I am obliged to you, Sir Rowland," Gideon said. "Do not thank me yet," Ashby said. "Thank me when the man is behind bars and not a day before. Men like your cousin have a way of finding the one crack a case has not thought to seal, and I would not have either of you grow careless from confidence before the matter is properly closed." He gathered his hat and gloves, pausing a moment at the library door. "I knew your father 40 years, Sir Gideon. He was the sort of man who believed the law existed to protect the weak from the strong, not merely to settle disputes between gentlemen of equal standing. I think he would be gratified to see his son fighting in that same spirit, whatever it has cost you to arrive at the fighting of it." It was advice, Verity thought afterward, that proved a good deal more prescient than any of them could have known at the time. Sedgwick's flight to Boston, once confirmed, prompted Blackwood to send his own clerk after him within the day, on the theory that a footman fleeing on his own account, with limited funds and no great skill at evasion, would prove a good deal easier to run to ground than a physician of independent means. The clerk, a quiet, methodical young man named Whitfield, who had impressed Blackwood, he said, with a nose for finding people who did not wish to be found, traced Sedgwick within 4 days to a lodging house near the Boston docks, where he had taken a room under his own name, evidently believing himself beyond the reach of a Lincolnshire inquiry, once he had put 30 miles of open country between himself and the Hall. A man who runs without troubling to change his name, Blackwood observed, when Whitfield's report reached the Hall, is not generally a man who has thought his flight through with any great care. I should expect him to talk rather more freely than his employer would like, once he understands the alternative. He was not wrong. Sedgwick's statement, taken by a local magistrate at Boston and forwarded to Blackwood within the week, confirmed in plain terms what the wage book had already suggested, that he had been paid, over and above his ordinary wages, a sum he described frankly as more money than he had ever expected to see in one place, in exchange for carrying the girth strap to Coop's shop with instructions to say nothing of it, and for reporting, periodically, on the ordinary business of the household, to Mr. Edgar Marchmont directly. "I didn't think on it as murder, sir," the statement read, in Whitfield's careful transcription. "I thought it some manner of trick between gentlemen, the kind I'd no business questioning. I'm not proud of it now, knowing what came of it, but I'll swear to every word I've said here, if it does Sir Gideon any good after the wrong I've done him." "It will do him a great deal of good," Gideon said, reading the statement over Verity's shoulder in the library, his voice carefully controlled. "Though I confess I find it a strange kind of comfort to learn that the man who nearly killed me did not think of it as murder at all, merely as a trick he had no business questioning. That is rather the shape of most cruelty I have found," Verity said. "Very few men set out each morning intending wickedness. They set out intending only to do the one small thing asked of them, and trust that someone else has already weighed whether the whole of it is right." The evidence now stood assembled in a manner that even Blackwood, hardened by 40 years of practice, admitted he found unusually complete: the settlement clause, the price correspondence, Coop's account, Slate's testimony, the apothecary's figures, Frobisher's written opinion, and now Sedgwick's own signed confession, each thread reinforcing the others, until the whole formed a rope no single denial could easily fray. "We are ready," Blackwood said, gathering the papers into their case with evident satisfaction, "or as ready as 40 years of practice tells me any case is like to be, before it meets a courtroom's particular gift for finding the one weakness a solicitor did not think to guard against. I shall return to London within the week to file the petition properly. In the meantime, I would advise both of you to go on, precisely as you have been quiet, watchful, and giving your cousin no further cause to suspect how thin the ice beneath him has grown." He paused at the library door, turning back for a moment with an expression that had softened out of its usual brisk efficiency. "I will say one thing more, and then I shall trouble you no further with an old solicitor's sentiment. In 40 years, I have rarely seen two people arrive at a marriage under worse circumstances, nor build, out of those circumstances, anything half so solid as what I have watched the two of you construct these past weeks. Whatever the courts decide, Sir Gideon, Lady Marchmont, I think you have already won the harder half of this business, and won it without any court's help at all." Neither of them answered him directly, though Verity felt Gideon's hand find hers beneath the library table, and hold it there, long after Blackwood's footsteps had faded down the passage toward the waiting carriage. Gideon traveled to Peterborough himself in the second week of November, to be present when Blackwood's clerk finally ran doctor. Thorne to ground at the coaching inn where he had been lodging under his own name, evidently not yet understanding how close the net around him had drawn. It was thought best that Verity remain at the Hall, both to keep the ordinary appearance of the household undisturbed, and because Blackwood judged, rightly as it turned out, that a physician cornered by a solicitor and a magistrate's constable together would talk a good deal more freely without a baronet's wife looking on to remind him what, precisely, he stood accused of having done. "I do not like leaving you," Gideon said, the morning of his departure, standing in the entrance hall with his traveling case already strapped to the gig. Not with matters as unsettled as they are. I am not made of glass, Sir Gideon, Verity said, though something in her chest had tightened at the prospect of the empty house, a feeling she was careful not to let show in her voice. And Mrs. Yardley is here, and Slate not a mile off, and I have managed rather harder things these 2 years past than 3 days alone, in a house I have come to know a good deal better than my cousin-in-law ever troubled to learn it. All the same, Gideon said, if anything should feel wrong while I am gone, however small, you are to send for Slate at once, and not wait to judge whether it is worth the trouble of asking. I promise, Verity said, and meant it rather more than she let her voice show, some instinct she could not have named making her glad afterward that she had given her word so plainly. Gideon was to be gone 3 days. He was gone rather longer than that, in the end, Thorne's confession proving a slower business to extract and properly witness than Blackwood had hoped, and it was on the second evening of his absence, with an early dark come down over the home farm and Mrs. Yardley gone to the village to see her sister, that Verity heard hooves on the drive and looked up from the library table to see, through the tall window, Edgar Marchmont dismounting alone in the last gray light. She had a moment, no more, to decide how to receive him, and chose in the end simply to receive him as herself no soft, grateful performance this time, for she judged correctly that a man who had come alone, at dusk, with Gideon known to be from home, had not come expecting to find a frightened bride, and would trust the sight of one considerably less than he would trust the truth. Mr. Marchmont, she said, meeting him in the entrance hall herself, rather than waiting for a servant to announce him, Mrs. Yardley being absent and the other staff occupied below stairs. My husband is not at home. So I understand, Edgar said, and something in his voice had shed most of its practiced warmth already, as though he had judged the performance no longer worth the effort of maintaining it in private. It is you I have come to see, Lady Marchmont. I think we have a great deal to discuss, you and I, now that Gideon is conveniently occupied elsewhere. Then discuss it, in the drawing-room, Verity said, where a servant may bring tea, and where I need not stand in a cold hall to hear whatever it is you have ridden here after dark to say. She led him there deliberately, choosing the room nearest the kitchen passage rather than the more private library, and rang for tea with a steadiness that cost her a good deal more than it appeared to. And it was only once the door had closed behind the maid who brought it that Edgar allowed the last of his social manner to fall away entirely. You have been busy, he said without preamble, a saddler in the village, suddenly remembering a conversation 2 years old, a physician's assistant asking rather pointed questions of an apothecary's books, a solicitor from Chancery Lane taking rooms in my own county as though he means to stay the winter. I confess, Lady Marchmont, I underestimated you rather badly. You underestimated a great many things, Verity said, keeping her voice level with an effort. Chiefly, I think, the possibility that a bride you had built out of your own arrangement might turn out to be a person in her own right, with a mind of her own and a father's memory to answer for. Ah, yes, Josiah Fenwick. Edgar said the name with a small, considering smile that made Verity's skin go cold. A pity, that business. Price was rather more thorough than I required in the end. I asked only that he find me a family in sufficient difficulty to be grateful for rescue. I did not ask him to hasten the difficulty along quite so efficiently as he did, though I confess I did not lose much sleep over it, once it was done. The casual cruelty of it, the offhand admission, delivered as though it cost him nothing at all, settled into Verity's chest like a stone, and she made herself breathe around it rather than let it show on her face, because she understood, with sudden and total clarity, that the man sitting across from her had stopped performing entirely, and a man who has stopped performing in front of a witness is a man who no longer expects that witness to leave the room and repeat what she has heard. What is it you want, Mr. Marchmont? She said, now that you have ridden here to tell me so plainly what I had already begun to suspect. I want you to persuade my cousin to withdraw his petition, Edgar said. I want the settlement clause honored as written, and the marks against Thorne, and that fool Coop quietly dropped, and in exchange, Lady Marchmont, I am prepared to be considerably more generous than the law would otherwise oblige me to be. You may keep your allowance. Your mother may keep her cottage. wherever I choose to settle her. Gideon may keep the appearance of his dignity, provided he stops fighting a battle he has already lost. He leaned forward slightly. You have no notion, I think, of what I have given up, watching that man inherit everything, simply for the accident of being born 11 months before me. My father got a stipend and a spare room in a house that was never once going to be his. I have waited 38 years for a fairness the law was never going to grant me, and I am not prepared to wait through a christening as well. Watching my cousin get a son who will shut the last door in my face forever the moment he draws breath. And so you arranged an accident meant to kill him, Verity said quietly, and when that failed, you arranged instead to keep him weak enough that no court would ever question whatever you chose to do with what remained of his life. Something in Edgar's face went very still. That, he said, is an accusation I would advise you not to repeat outside this room, Lady Marchmont, unless you are prepared to have it proved considerably harder than you imagine. I am not without friends in this county, nor without means to make life difficult for a woman, with no family name of her own to shelter behind, should she persist in making trouble for mine. I have a family name, Verity said, her voice steady, though her heart had begun to beat very hard indeed. It is Fenwick, and it was a good name, honestly earned, before your mister. Price saw fit to grind it into the dirt for your convenience. I do not shelter behind a Marchmont's name, Mr. Marchmont. I stand in front of my own, and I find I am not half so easily frightened by veiled threats as you appear to have expected. He rose then, and moved toward the small writing desk near the window. The desk, Verity realized with a jolt of cold understanding, where she had left her own correspondence with Blackwood not an hour before, folded but not yet locked away, having meant to add to it before supper. I wonder, Edgar said, his hand already reaching toward the desk's drawer, what else you have been putting to paper these past weeks, that I have not yet had the pleasure of reading. Verity moved before she had properly decided to, placing herself between him and the desk, with a speed that surprised them both. That correspondence is mine, Mr. Marchmont, and privileged besides, being between myself and my husband's solicitor. You have no right to it. I have every right that necessity grants a desperate man, Edgar said, and for the first time that evening, something in his voice had lost its careful control entirely, gone rough and low, with a fear he could no longer quite disguise as confidence. Step aside, Lady Marchmont. I do not wish to make this unpleasant. You made it unpleasant the moment you rode here alone, after dark, to threaten a woman in her own drawing-room, Verity said, and found rather to her own surprise that her voice did not shake at all. I will not step aside. You do not understand what is at stake for me, Edgar said, and something almost pleading had crept into his voice, now beneath the anger, the sound of a man arguing less to persuade her than to persuade himself. 38 years, Lady Marchmont. 38 years of watching my cousin be handed everything by an accident of birth 11 months earlier than my own, and being told to be grateful for the leavings. I did not choose to be born second. I did not choose a father passed over for a stipend while his brother took 4,000 acres. And now, when I have finally built something that might have set that wrong right, I am to be undone by a bride I found myself, in a house I have run for 2 years, while my cousin sat behind a locked door and called it grief. You are not undone by me, Verity said. You are undone by your own choices, mister. Marchmont, by a saddle strap weakened in the dark, by a physician bribed to poison a man slowly enough that no coroner would ever call it murder, by a family's ruin arranged 3 counties distant simply because it suited your purposes. I did not do any of that to you. You did it to yourself, and I am merely the first person patient enough to prove it. Something in Edgar's face flickered not quite shame, but close enough to its shape that Verity almost, for one unguarded instant, felt something like pity for him. It was in that moment, with Edgar's hand still half raised, and his face gone the color of a man who has just heard his own worst intentions spoken back to him plainly, that the drawing-room door opened without a knock, and Obadiah Slate stood in the frame, hat in hand, having come, as he explained afterward, to bring word of a matter concerning the home farm boundary, and having been let in by the under-housemaid, the only servant left in the house besides, who had heard raised voices through the door, and thought it wise to fetch someone larger than herself. Slate took in the scene, Edgar half risen, Verity planted before the desk, the air in the room gone thick with something that needed no further explanation in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, and said, in a voice pitched with deliberate, unhurried mildness, "Beg pardon, my lady. I didn't know you'd company. I'll wait in the hall if it's all the same, though I confess I'm in no great hurry to go far, should you want me for anything at all." Edgar's hand withdrew from the drawer. He straightened his coat with the particular over-careful movements of a man reassembling a composure that has just been badly cracked, and when he spoke again, the smooth warmth had returned to his voice, though it fooled no one in the room any longer, least of all himself. "I was just leaving," he said. "Lady Marchmont and I have had a very illuminating conversation, and I believe we understand one another rather better than we did an hour ago." "I believe we do," Verity said, and did not move from where she stood until she had heard his horse's hooves fade entirely down the drive, at which point her knees, which had held admirably steady throughout the whole encounter, chose that moment to remember that they had been very frightened indeed. Slate stayed with her the rest of that evening, refusing all her assurances that she was perfectly recovered and would take no harm from being left alone, and it was his steady, unhurried presence in the kitchen, drinking tea he did not particularly want, discussing the home farm boundary he had no urgent business to discuss, that let Verity's hands finally stop their small, persistent trembling by the time Mrs. Yardley returned from the village and was told, in careful and considerably calmer terms than the actual events had warranted, what had passed in her absence. "I ought never to have gone to my sister's tonight of all nights, Mrs. Yardley said, white-faced, once she had heard the whole of it. "I'll not leave this house unguarded again, while that man's still walking free, my lady. Whatever excuse calls me away." "You could not have known," Verity said. "None of us could have known he would come while Gideon was from home. I do not think even he had planned it so precisely. I believe he came in something very near to panic. Once Blackwood's presence in the county told him his own timing had run out faster than he had allowed for." "Panic or no," Slate said, setting down his cup, "a frightened man with something to lose is a good deal more dangerous than a confident one, my lady. And I'll be glad when this business is properly finished, and he's somewhere he can do no further harm to anybody." Gideon returned from Peterborough the following afternoon to find his wife pale but composed, Obadiah Slate still installed in the kitchen with a cup of Mrs. Yardley's tea and no apparent intention of leaving until Sir Gideon himself had heard the whole account, and a letter already written to Blackwood setting down, in Verity's own careful hand, every word Edgar had spoken in that drawing-room, sworn to before the same local justice of the peace who had already taken Coop's account some weeks before. Gideon listened to the whole account without once interrupting, his face growing steadily more still as it went on, until, at the end, he crossed the room to where Verity sat, and took both her hands in his without a word, holding them for a long moment as though reassuring himself, through touch alone, that she was truly unharmed. "I should not have left you," he said finally, his voice rough. "Whatever Blackwood judged necessary in Peterborough, I should not have left this house while that man remained free to come here." "You could not have known he would come," Verity said, "and I was not so very unharmed as you seem to fear, Gideon. Frightened, yes, angry, considerably more than frightened, once the fright had passed, but not harmed. Slate came in good time, and I do not believe, in the end, that Edgar intended violence so much as intimidation, though I grant you the distinction grew rather thin toward the last of it. He as good as confessed to arranging your father's ruin, and to knowing exactly what had been done to weaken my recovery. Verity told him, once he had heard the whole of it and sat, for a long moment, entirely silent, his hand gripping the arm of his chair hard enough to whiten the knuckles. And he all but confirmed, in his own words, precisely what he stands to lose, should we ever have a son. I do not think, Gideon, that he came here meaning to persuade me at all. I think he came here in something very near to panic, because Blackwood's presence in the county has told him his own timing has run out faster than he planned for. A frightened man is a dangerous man, Gideon said, but he is also, very often, a careless one. We move on him now, before he has time to recover his nerve and cover whatever traces remain of tonight's visit. Blackwood, sent for express, arrived within 2 days, and read Verity's sworn account with the same grim satisfaction he had shown over every previous document, though his face, when he finished, was graver than Verity had yet seen it. "This changes the character of the matter considerably," he said. "A threat made in person to a lady in her own home, in an attempt to suppress evidence already lodged with her solicitor, that is itself an offense the law takes very seriously, quite apart from everything that came before it. I shall file for an immediate hearing, and I shall ask the court to consider whether your cousin ought to be detained, pending the outcome, given what we now have reason to believe he is capable of when he judges himself sufficiently desperate." The court, when the matter was laid before it, agreed. A warrant was issued within the week for Edgar Marchmont's appearance before the vice-chancellor, and it was Blackwood's own information, gathered through a network of correspondence he maintained at every coaching inn and posting house on the principal roads north, that placed Edgar, 2 days after the warrant was issued, boarding a mail coach bound for the coast under an assumed name, a considerable sum in banknotes about his person, and no luggage beyond what a man could carry who did not intend to return. "He has chosen Boston, it seems, rather than the more obvious road to London," Blackwood observed, reading the report from his correspondent with evident satisfaction, "which tells me he has some notion of taking passage from a smaller port where fewer questions are asked of a gentleman traveling alone. It is, if I may say so, precisely the sort of decision a clever man makes when panic has begun to outpace his cleverness. He was taken at Boston, on the Lincolnshire coast, by a constable alerted through Blackwood's swift correspondence, still some hours short of a packet bound for the continent, and brought back to Lincoln under guard to await the chancery hearing he had once meant to bring against his own cousin. Gideon received the news of his capture in silence, sitting for a long moment with the letter in his hand before setting it down. "I find I take less satisfaction in it than I expected to," he said finally. "I thought I should feel triumphant, hearing that he had been run to ground like a common thief. Instead, I find myself merely tired and rather sad, for the boy I once knew who taught me to ride a green horse, and never once, so far as I could tell at the time, begrudged me a single thing." "You are allowed both," Verity said. "Triumph at justice done and grief for what might have been, had he chosen differently. One does not cancel the other, whatever a person might wish." The petition came on for hearing some 3 weeks later, in a paneled room in Lincoln's Inn Fields that smelled of dust and old law, before a vice-chancellor named Pell, whose reputation, Blackwood assured them beforehand, was for exactness rather than sentiment, which suited their case a good deal better than sentiment would have done. The room was fuller than Verity had expected, for a matter she had thought concerned only 3 people's private ruin, a scattering of clerks and law students come to observe, a reporter from one of the London papers taking notes with evident interest, and, seated near the back, unexpectedly, Sir Rowland Ashby himself, who had traveled down from Lincolnshire. He told them beforehand, because he had given his word to see the matter properly closed, and a magistrate's word, in his view, extended rather further than his own county's boundary when the circumstances warranted it. Dr. Thorne, whose confession had by now been fully taken and witnessed, was not present in person, his testimony submitted instead as a sworn deposition read into the record by Mr. Aubrey Pennington, rising for Gideon, in a voice that grew no louder and no more urgent for the weight of what it carried, which made the weight of it, if anything, land harder upon the room for the restraint. Pennington read the marriage settlement's trustee clause, tracing its careful drafting to the same hand behind the correspondence with Mr. Price. He read Coop's account of the weakened girth strap, and Slate's account of the intimidation that had followed it. He read Sedgwick's own signed confession, naming Edgar Marchmont directly as the man who had ordered the strap weakened and later arranged his flight. He read Frobisher's written opinion, and the apothecary's own figures corroborating it. And last he read Verity's own sworn account of the confrontation in the drawing-room, in which Edgar Marchmont had in his own words confirmed the whole design. Mr. Cornelius Vane, rising for Edgar, argued, with a competence Verity privately allowed was rather better than the case deserved, that a desperate man's words spoken in a moment of panic ought not to be weighed as heavily as a considered confession, and that a servant's statement, given to save his own neck once caught and confronted with the alternative, wanted rather more independent corroboration than the court had yet been shown before it could safely be relied upon to convict a gentleman of Mr. Marchmont's standing. "A fair point, Mr. Vane, so far as it goes," Pennington replied, when his turn came again, save that Sedgwick's confession does not stand alone. It is corroborated in every material particular by Coop's independent account of the strap itself, by the wage book showing payments made to Sedgwick that no innocent explanation has yet been offered for, and by Lady Marchmont's own sworn account of Mr. Marchmont's confession in her hearing not 3 weeks past. A turncoat's word, taken alone, might reasonably be doubted, my lord. A turncoat's word confirmed independently 4 times over is not so easily set aside. A murmur went through the room at this, quickly stilled, and Verity felt Gideon's hand tighten briefly over her own, where it rested on the arm of his chair. Vice-Chancellor Pell heard the whole of it without visible reaction, in the manner of a man who had long ago trained himself out of visible reaction as an occupational habit, and when both barristers had finished, he was quiet a long moment, turning over a single sheet of paper before him, as though weighing it by hand rather than by argument. "Mr. Vane," he said at last, "does your client wish to answer any part of what has been read?" Edgar, seated beside his barrister with a stillness that had nothing of composure left in it, said nothing at all. "Then I find as follows," the Vice-Chancellor said. The petition brought by Mr. Edgar Marchmont, alleging the unsoundness of mind of Sir Gideon Marchmont, is dismissed, the evidence before this court establishing rather the reverse, a gentleman of sound faculties, deliberately and unlawfully weakened by design, for the precise purpose of supporting the very petition now before me. I find further that the marriage settlement's trustee clause was drawn in bad faith, and I direct it be struck from the instrument entirely. I find the financial dealings with Mr. Price, touching the ruin of the late Josiah Fenwick, to constitute a fraud of considerable and deliberate cruelty. And I find that the matter touching the events on Hollow Lane, and the confrontation more recently at Marchmont Hall, involves credible allegations of attempted murder and intimidation that fall properly within the jurisdiction of the criminal courts, and not this one. I shall refer the whole of this record to the Crown, for Mr. Edgar Marchmont to answer at the next Lincolnshire assizes on such charges as the evidence supports, and given his own attempt at flight, I direct that he remain in custody until that trial, rather than be released on any surety. The tipstaff moved forward before the Vice-Chancellor had quite finished speaking, and Edgar rose to meet him without a word, his face gone entirely blank in the particular way of a man who has run out, all at once, of anything left to perform. He paused only once at the door and looked back not at the Vice-Chancellor, not at Pennington, but at Gideon, seated with Verity's hand resting lightly on the arm of his chair. "You were never meant to fight back," Edgar said, low enough that it barely carried. "That was the whole of the plan, Gideon. You were meant to sit quiet and let it happen, the way you'd sat quiet for 2 years already." "I know," Gideon said. "I am sorry it disappointed you." Edgar said nothing further. The door closed behind him, and Lincoln's Inn Fields went on about its ordinary business outside the window, entirely unaware that a fraud 2 years in the making had just come apart inside one paneled room, in rather less time than it had taken to build. They traveled back to Lincolnshire slowly, by easy stages, Gideon's strength genuinely tended now, under Frobisher's honest care rather than Thorne's careful sabotage, improving by small, steady degrees each week. Mrs. Yardley received the news of the Vice-Chancellor's ruling with a composure that lasted exactly as long as it took her to close the drawing-room door behind her, and considerably less time after that, judging by the sound of it, which nobody in the household troubled to remark upon, out of a general and unspoken agreement that some tears were nobody's business but the crier's own. "I knew that boy when his laugh could fill the whole of this house end to end," she told Verity, some says later, when the two of them sat together over the mending in a quiet hour, her composure fully restored and her needle moving with its ordinary brisk efficiency. "I began to fear, these 2 years past, that laugh had gone for good, buried under whatever that man and his cousin between them had done to him. I'll own I did not expect to hear it again in my lifetime, my lady, and I have you to thank for the hearing of it. You had rather more to do with it than you credit yourself. Verity said. You warned me, the very first week, what he would do drive me off before I could choose to stay, so that he might tell himself he had known all along that I would go. I do not think I should have known to watch for it, without your telling me. It is a strange kind of gift, Mrs. Yardley, to hand a stranger the one warning that lets her see a whole household clearly, and I do not think I have properly thanked you for it until this moment. Well, Mrs. Yardley's needle paused a moment. I've watched that family 30 year, my lady. I know its weathers rather better than I know my own, I sometimes think. It does an old woman good to see a storm finally pass rather than merely darken further. Verity wrote to her mother that same week with the whole of it set down plain, and received by return of post a reply so full of relief and disbelief in equal measure that it ran to 4 crossed pages, the ink growing steadily, more hurried toward the end, as though Mrs. Fenwick had feared the feeling behind the words might escape her before she had finished setting them all down. Gideon, reading it over Verity's shoulder with her permission, reached the final page and said, without any preamble at all, she must come to us. Not for a visit, Verity. To live if she will have it. There is a dower cottage on the home farm that has stood empty these 10 years, and wants only a fire lit in it, and someone glad to live there. You have not even met her, Verity said, though the offer had already begun, she suspected, to show rather too plainly in her own face how much she wanted to accept it on her mother's behalf. I have met her daughter, Gideon said, and find I have formed a very favorable opinion of the woman who raised her. Mrs. Fenwick arrived at Marchmont Hall in the first mild week of the following March, traveling by post-chaise with 2 trunks and a great deal more composure than her daughter had expected, and stood in the drive looking up at a house considerably grander than any she had set foot in since her own girlhood, before turning to Verity with an expression that mixed pride and grief, and something that might in time become simple contentment, all at once. Well, she said, taking in the whole broad front of the hall, with a single measuring glance that reminded Verity, with a sudden ache, of her father's own way of sizing up a length of good lace before he named its price. I see you have not been idle, my dear. No, Verity said. I have not. Spring came properly to Lincolnshire that year, in a way it had not managed the year before, the fields greening early, and the tenant family speaking, for the first time in 3 years, of a harvest they might reasonably hope to be glad of, rather than merely survive. Gideon walked the home farm boundary on his own 2 feet, that April slowly, and with a cane he still needed but no longer resented, Obadiah Slate falling into step beside him to talk over the spring planting the way. Verity understood without being told. The 2 of them might once have talked. In the years before his accident, and a cousin's greed had come between a landlord and the land he was born to look after. Mrs. Fenwick settled into the dower cottage with a swiftness that surprised everyone but Verity, who had known her mother's capacity for quiet practical resilience since childhood, and within a month had made herself as indispensable to the small household as she had once been to her husband's failing lace trade, keeping the cottage garden, mending linens for half the tenant farms, and developing, to Mrs. Yardley's evident delight, a friendship built on shared decades of running households, on careful means and carefuller judgment. It was on one such April afternoon, walking the same stretch of boundary where Slate had first told them of a saddler's suspicious errand, that Gideon stopped, quite without warning, and said the thing he had, by his own later admission, been working up the courage to say for some weeks past. I have been in love with you, he said, since very nearly the fortnight of our acquaintance, when you asked me to what end a man would go to such trouble over a bride's own marriage settlement, and I understood, watching you turn the reasoning over in your own mind, that you were not merely clever, but braver than any woman I had yet met. I did not permit myself to know it plainly until a good while afterward, but I believe, looking back on it honestly, that the settlement clause is where it properly began. Verity considered this with the same careful attention she gave any claim laid before her as fact. I believe I began somewhat earlier, she said. The first night, in fact, when you would not call for help, and let me see the whole of your fury and your shame at once, rather than performing some easier version of yourself for my benefit. I did not say so at the time, because there seemed a great deal of other work still to be done, and love, I have found, keeps rather better than a conspiracy does. It does not spoil for being left to wait its turn. And has its turn come now? Gideon asked. I believe it has, Verity said, and took his offered arm as they turned back toward the house together, the home farm's new green stretching out on every side of them under a sky that had, for the first spring in 3 years, no cause left to threaten rain it could not deliver. I have thought, once or twice, Gideon said, as they walked, about what I might have become. Had you never come to this house at all, I do not think I flatter myself unduly in believing I should have been dead within another year, one way or another, either by my cousin's design, or simply by the slow business of giving up entirely, which amounts to much the same thing in the end. You would not have given up, Verity said. I have come to know you rather too well these 6 months to believe that of you, whatever you believed of yourself before I arrived. Perhaps not, Gideon allowed, but I confess I do not much care to test the theory, now that I need not. I would rather simply be glad you came, and leave the question of what might have been to men with less pressing uses for their afternoons. She laughed at that properly, the sound carrying out across the fresh green fields, and Gideon, watching her, thought that he had married a stranger out of desperation and found, by some accounting he did not fully understand and had long since stopped trying to, that the stranger had become the truest thing in his life. They walked in comfortable silence a while longer, the home farm's boundary stretching out ahead of them toward the low stone bridge, where Slate had first spoken of a saddler's suspicious errand, and Verity found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that a place once so freighted with danger and discovery had become, over the slow accumulation of months, simply a pleasant stretch of ground to walk of an April afternoon, hand in hand with a man she had once believed she would spend her whole life merely tolerating. She thought, too, of her father, and of how proud he would have been to see her standing here, not as a grateful bride settled quietly into someone else's grand design, but as a woman who had fought for her own place in the shape of things, and won it honestly. Tell me something, she said eventually, her voice softer than before. Do you ever think of Edgar without anger? I do not ask to press an old wound. I ask because I find I still think of Price sometimes, and the thinking is never quite so simple as I should like it to be. Gideon considered this honestly, in the manner she had come to expect of him. Sometimes, he admitted. Not often, and never for long. But there are moments watching Slate's boys at their work, or hearing Mrs. Yardley laugh properly for the first time in years, when I think of the boy who taught me to ride, and I grieve him a little, the way one grieves a person who died some years before their body caught up with the fact of it. I do not forgive what the man became, but I find I have not entirely stopped mourning what he once was, before ambition ate the rest of him alive. That seems to me the most honest way to carry it, Verity said. Grief and justice are not enemies, whatever the courts might have us believe. A person may want both at once and be entitled to both at once, without either canceling the other out. I do not think either of us owes the world a tidier grief than the one we actually carry, whatever shape it happens to take. It was in the great hall itself, some weeks later, on an evening when the last of the day's light still held gold along the western windows, that he asked her to watch him try standing properly, without the excuse of privacy to hide a possible failure, one final time before Frobisher pronounced the exercise no longer a trial, but simply a habit, worth doing for its own sake rather than as proof of anything at all. I used to be rather good at this room, he said, standing with one hand braced lightly on the back of a chair, the cane hooked over its arm should he need it. Not this precisely. Standing in it, I mean, without falling. I know, Verity said. I was here the first time you fell in it. I remember rather clearly. Then you will forgive me if I ask you to stay this time and watch the other version of it. He drew a breath, released the chair, and stood swaying only slightly, one hand still hovering near the cane but not touching it for the length of perhaps 10 seconds, which was, Verity thought, watching him, very possibly the longest 10 seconds either of them had ever lived through. He did not fall. He lowered himself carefully back into the chair before his strength gave out rather than waiting for it to fail him, which she understood, without his needing to explain it, was itself a kind of victory not merely standing, but choosing the moment to stop, rather than being chosen by it. Well, he said, a little breathless, and holding out his hand to her all the same. "What do you think, Lady Marchmont? Was that so very hard?" She crossed the room and took his offered hand, and did not answer him at once, because some things were better answered by staying exactly where she was than by any words she might have chosen instead. "No," she said finally, "it was not so very hard at all. Though I confess I should like to see you try it again tomorrow, and the day after that, until I have quite lost count of how many times." "You never were a woman who tired of counting," Gideon said. "No," she agreed. "I find I have grown rather fond of it." Outside the tall windows of the great hall, the Lincolnshire dusk was coming down soft and blue over fields that stood, this spring, under a landlord who had fought properly for them at last, and had not fought alone, and beyond those fields, a mile off along the home farm lane, a small dower cottage stood with its own fire lit, and its own new tenants settling, by slow and careful degrees, into a life she had not expected to be given twice. And somewhere in the hall's quiet evening light, with her hand still in his, and the whole long difficult shape of the past 6 months settled at last into something that might fairly be called peace, Verity Marchmont thought that whatever else this marriage had begun as a scheme, a stranger's cruel convenience, a settlement clause, neither of them had troubled to read it, had become, by the slow and stubborn accumulation of half a hard year, something considerably more honest than either of them had been promised, and a good deal harder won. That, she thought, watching him gather his breath for another try, was very likely the only kind of promise worth keeping in the first place. Later that same evening, after supper, after Mrs. Yardley had cleared away the last of the dishes with her customary brisk satisfaction and retired for the night, Gideon and Verity sat together in the library where so much of their war had been fought and won, the fire burning low and companionable rather than urgent, and neither of them troubled to fill the silence with anything more than the occasional turn of a page, or the small, comfortable sounds of two people, content simply to share a room. "I have been thinking," Gideon said eventually, "that we ought to open the ballroom again, come summer. Properly, I mean music, and the whole county invited, the way my father used to do it every Michaelmas, before I let 2 years of grief close the doors on it entirely." "I think that is an excellent idea," Verity said, "though I hope you do not intend to spend the whole evening in that chair by the wall, watching everyone else dance." "No," Gideon said, and something in his voice carried a quiet certainty that had not been there 6 months before. "I rather think, by summer, I shall manage a dance or two myself, provided my partner does not object to a rather slower pace than the fashionable sort require." "I have never much cared for fashionable pacing in anything," Verity said. "I find I prefer things done properly, however long the doing takes." He reached for her hand then, across the small distance between their two chairs, and she gave it willingly, and they sat like that a good while longer, saying nothing further, because there are evenings when silence between two people says everything that words might only diminish by the saying.